Chapter 11. All through Rigel's second week at Hogwarts she felt like a bug trapped in a glass jar and put on display in Snape's office. Eyes, everywhere she felt eyes on her, heavy and itchy, and her shoulder blades twitched with the needles of scrutiny she could feel but not pick out. Someone or multiple someones were watching her, and it was slowly grating on her nerves. The feeling varied with intensity. It was worse during meal times, so Rigel was fairly sure at least one of her observers was from another house or year. It was nothing like Draco's patented Malfoy gaze or Pansy's coyly assessing look, so Rigel felt safe with her friends, but everywhere else she was on her guard, making sure to never show weakness, to keep her injury hidden, and to act as uninteresting and even stupid as possible. She hoped whoever was watching her would eventually get bored and quit, but it didn't seem likely to be so easy, especially considering at least one set of eyes probably belonged to her mysterious attacker. So she played the bumbling, unexciting first year, a role that was made extremely believable by her performance in most of her classes. Rigel's grades in herbology, history of magic, astronomy, and potions were just fine, but charms, transfiguration, and defense against the dark arts were proving nearly impossible for her. After her stuttering success the first week, she hadn't been able to get any of the charms or spells they learned to work, much to her professor's exasperation, and even the flying instructor had looked disappointedly at her as she wobbled in the air on Wednesday, her right and only usable arm shaking on her broom and compromising her control. She'd worn out her arm muscles potting plants one-handed in herbology that morning, and even Neville had managed better balance on his broom than her. At the same time, her friendship with Pansy and Draco grew by leaps and bounds. She spent nearly all her time with them, since they were among the only people she was sure had nothing to do with her ill-wisher, and by the end of the week, the stiff, linen formality of their friendship had given way to the malleable threads of common interests and mutual, allied affection. They respected her privacy in most matters, though she didn't begrudge them general information about her dad Sirius, and she tried to be as forthcoming as possible about her life before Hogwarts while still not giving away her true origins. In return they told her about their families, likes, dislikes, goals, and interests. Draco had decided his favorite subject was transfiguration, after flying, both because Dada was boring with Kirill as a teacher and because transfiguration was so difficult, and therefore an impressive thing to be good at. Rigel got the feeling most of Draco's goals revolved around being impressive, and therefore valuable to his father's career and worthy of being important to him. Pansy was quite good at charms, but she enjoyed astronomy best. She had a great interest in the night sky, and had already learned on her own much of what was taught their first year, but she didn't mind sitting through the lessons again, because she said the view of the sky was so much clearer from Hogwarts towers than what she was used to. The three became thicker than Goyle's skull, and although they associated with Zabini, Knot, Greengrass, and others in their year, the ones they looked for first when they entered a room were each other. Still, the eyes were making Rigel as irritable as a nesting dragoness, so when she noticed someone following her on her way to Transfiguration on Thursday afternoon, she whirled around angrily, determined to catch whoever was so interested in her in the act. Draco and Pansy were walking ahead of her, so they didn't notice when she suddenly arrested her motion and glared into space behind her, but Zabini did, and he stopped as well. "What is it?" he asked quietly. His dark eyes scanned the empty hallway behind them coolly, and as Rigel glanced at his blank expression she couldn't help but think he already knew the answer to his question. "I thought I noticed someone following us." Rigel decided against using me at the last moment, like a fluttering at the corner of my vision. Zabini smiled a wolf's smile. "So you finally noticed. The little blonde butterfly has been trailing you all week." "Butterfly?" Rigel blinked, turning to check behind them once more. The hallway was still empty, but wait. The top of her head peeked briefly around the corner at the end of the hall, before being snatched back. Rigel frowned and started after it, but Zabini's firm hand on her right shoulder held her back. "They'll be gone by the time you get there," he said, removing his hand politely now that he had her attention. "Can you not hear the frantic beating of wings in flight?" She cocked her head sideways and realized she could indeed hear the sound of running footsteps fading quickly. She pressed her lips together in frustration, and turned back to Zabini, who was looking at her with amusement. "Why didn't you tell me someone was following me?" "Who was that?" "If you had not noticed eventually, you would not deserve to be told," he said, moving away from her and starting toward their classroom once more. "As for who it was, I imagine you'll know soon enough. Come along, Black, You don't want to be late for the quiz today. Rigel hurried to catch up, dismissing the strange incident in favor of worrying about the quiz she was about to fail. She and Zabinai made it into the classroom just in time, and Rigel claimed her usual seat between Pansy and Draco while McGonagall was passing out the written portion of the test. You will have 30 minutes to complete the short answer section. You won't need all 30 minutes, but I will be coming around to each of you and asking you to demonstrate the matchstick to needle transfiguration for me while you work. Please turn over your papers, and begin. Professor McGonagall waved her wand and a projection of the current time appeared on the board. Rigel turned her quiz over and worked steadily through it. The questions started out fairly straightforward, name the 5 elemental laws of transfiguration, and slowly became more theoretical. Why is it harder to attempt to turn an inanimate object animate, rather than the other way around, until she reached the last question, how would you classify a transfiguration that resulted in a beetle growing the nose of a mouse and a mouse losing its nose completely? She was confident in all of her answers, which had been discussed both in class and in the textbook, but glancing around at her peers she was surprised to find most of them frowning dejectedly or else staring blankly at their papers. McGonagall was slowly making her way around the room, and by the time she got to their table, Rigel, Pansy, and Draco had all 3 finished their quizzes and turned them face down on the table so they could chat quietly. The professor placed a matchstick in front of Pansy first. Please turn this into a needle, Miss Parkinson, and know that your grade is not based solely on the final result, so don't be nervous if you can't change it all the way. Pansy picked up her wand and waved it confidently, speaking the incantation clearly and carefully, if not very firmly. Her matchstick seemed to hesitate for an instant, vibrating slightly as it wavered, then all at once it became a shiny, silver needle and lay still again. McGonagall picked it up and inspected it, checking the hole and the point, and nodded approvingly. Very good. You next, Mr. Black. Rigel studied her matchstick apprehensively for a moment, before taking a deep breath and saying the incantation, automatically waving her wand in the complicated wrist movement over the match. It stayed a match. Professor McGonagall frowned slightly, but waved for her to try again. She tried a second time, and was sure her incantation was perfect and her wand movement precise, but no transformation occurred. After the third time, McGonagall made a small humming noise in the back of her throat, and said, "Take a moment to focus your intent, Mr. Black, while I test Mr. Malfoy." Draco shot her a worried glance, then focused on his own match. He set his mouth in an uncompromising line and glared at it, waving his wand precisely and speaking the spell forcefully. His transfiguration was less abrupt than Pansy's had been. His match morphed smoothly into a needle, as if it hadn't ever dreamed of being anything else, and Draco put his wand back down smugly. McGonagall inspected it, raising her eyebrows at the lethal-looking point, and nodded once more. "Very nice, Mr. Malfoy." The professor turned to Rigel once more. "Mr. Black, if you would." Rigel performed the wrist movement once more and said the incantation. She mentally tried to coax her magic into thinking she really wanted this match to be a needle. McGonagall, Pansy, Draco, and Rigel stared expectantly at the match, but no change occurred. It was still, and probably always would be, a match. McGonagall sighed and made a mark on her clipboard. "I can give you points for the correct incantation and wand movement, Mr. Black, but you'd best hope you did well on the written portion of this quiz. I expect more effort from you in the future." She moved on to the next table and Draco and Pansy immediately started comforting her. "You did everything right. It must have been a faulty match or something," Pansy said soothingly. "I'm sure it doesn't count for much of our grade, anyway." "That's right," Draco added, though his voice lacked true conviction. "You'll be able to make it up later in the term. Don't worry about it." "Yeah, thanks guys," Rigel said, stowing her useless wand in her bag and trying to ignore the looks coming from her classmates who had finished their quizzes in time to witness her failure. "At least it's over with," Draco said bracingly. "We won't have to think about it until Tuesday. And we've got double potions to look forward to tomorrow," Pansy said brightly. "That will take your mind off of it." Rigel smiled at her friends. "Thanks for lying to me. It helps." "Anytime," Draco said, and they all laughed softly. At the end of the lesson, most of the class bolted for the door, more than ready to get out and forget about classes for the day, but McGonagall called out, "Mr. Black, please stay behind," and so Rigel waved her friends ahead of her and slowly shouldered her bag, picking her way through the tables to the professor's desk. "Yes, Professor, she asked politely when everyone had left. Mr. Black, I'm sorry to say that you were the only first year in all of my classes who was unable to effect even a partial transfiguration for this quiz. The needle transfiguration is the very first thing I taught, and I thought for sure everyone would be able to manage it by the second week of school. The older woman peered concernedly through her spectacles at her. Can you explain why you are so far behind? No, Professor Rigel said, thinking dejectedly that if she could explain it, she would be halfway to fixing it. Very well, Professor McGonagall frowned, perhaps thinking she was just being difficult. In that case I have no choice but to assign you a detention for tomorrow night, to be served with Mr. Filch at 7 o'clock. I hope that this, along with the poor score that you will no doubt receive on your quiz today, will inspire you to take your studies a little more seriously. Yes, Professor Rigel said tonelessly. She accepted the detention slip, which told her to meet Filch in the trophy room at 7 on Friday, and left the classroom with a slight frown on her face, wondering how she was going to tell Pansy that she couldn't meet the people Pansy had wanted to introduce her to on Friday after all. Her friends were waiting outside the classroom, and they oohed sympathetically when they saw the pink slip of paper in her hands. That's so unfair, Pansy said, after reading the detention slip aloud for Draco's benefit. How can she give you detention for a bad grade? The grade's supposed to be the punishment. On Friday night, too, Draco grimaced, and with Filch. That's just cruel. Friday. Pansy double-checked the slip. Oh, darn, I'll have to introduce you to my new acquaintances another time, I suppose. Sorry, Rigel offered, reclaiming the slip and tucking it into her bag. It's not your fault, her friend waved her hand dismissively. I mean it is, sort of, but I don't blame you for getting detention specifically on Friday. We've really got to fix whatever this is, though, Draco said as they began walking toward the dungeons. Soon our ignorant classmates are going to think you really are a squib. Would you stop being my friend if I was? Rigel felt compelled to ask. Pansy and Draco shared a look that she wasn't pureblood enough to decipher. No, Pansy said slowly, we'd still be your friend, although it would become a great deal harder if the information got back to our parents. But you're not, so it doesn't matter, Draco said firmly. Stop being so morbid, and let's go practice Quidditch some more. Pansy can watch. Joy of joys, Pansy rolled her eyes. You'd better make it entertaining if I'm going to watch you flit about on an overgrown matchstick. Rigel shook the unhelpful thoughts from her brain easily and prepared herself for another session of awkward ball hitting for the benefit of Draco's seeker skills. Her left wrist gave a peremptory throb at the thought, but at least it would probably be the last one she'd have to endure, since tryouts were Saturday and she had detention the following night. Rigel didn't know how she was going to make it all the way to mid-October without anyone noticing her injury, but all she could do was take one day at a time. She was good at that. Friday night's detention was only eclipsed on the scale of misery by the time she and Archie had accidentally uncovered the portrait of Sirius' mother from the attic and activated it when Archie stumbled into the frame and cut himself, his blood breaking the sealing enchantment that was on it. The foul old woman had shrieked at them from her painted cage and Sirius had come running and caught them trying unsuccessfully to shut her up by putting drapes over the portrait. He had been livid, lecturing them about how long it had taken James and Remus to figure out how to seal the portrait away with blood magic and how much serious trouble they could have gotten into tramping about the Black family attic and spilling a Black heir's blood all over the place. Rigel and Archie had known he was mostly just worried for their safety and upset that he had to see his mother again to reseal her painting, but it was the only time she could ever remember Sirius being seriously angry at them, and until that day she hadn't really understood how ugly and perverted most of the Black family had been. The vitriol that awful woman had spewed at them shocked and scared the two 7-year-olds, and Wolbergar Black's demented cackle and phosphoric insults still haunted her dreams some nights. After that they were much more careful around old family artifacts. Filch's disdainful muttering all through her detention with him brought the memory of that day back fresh, and Rigel thought spitefully that it would serve both Filch and Wolbergar right to have been distant relations of some kind. The thought of the perceived shame the hateful old woman would have knowing she was related to a squib made Rigel smile vindictively as she polished trophies under the caretaker's watchful eyes. The way he sneered at her, mumbling insults and complaints under his breath to his cat while she worked, would have done the old Black family house elves proud, had any been alive to witness it. Rigel had been put to work straight away when she arrived at her detention, and was told in no uncertain terms that she would be here until the job was finished, the job being the polishing of every single trophy and award in the room. It took her hours to get through it all, due in part to the careful maneuvering she had to do around her crippled hand, and all the while the caretaker muttered and mumbled and generally acted like a crazed, bitter old cat lady. When she was finally done, she barely had enough time to make it to the dungeons before curfew, but she still felt nothing but pure relief and happiness when she exited the now sparkling trophy room. She was just breaking off of the entrance hall when she heard it, the faint echo of a single set of footsteps behind her. She didn't pause or give any indication that she noticed, but she did slow her breathing so she could hear better and wished she hadn't been too afraid of Filch searching her to bring the map that night. The footsteps got closer. Rigel estimated they were 10 meters behind her, and she turned the first corner in the dungeons calmly, despite her racing heartbeat. Just as she had decided to turn and surprise them before they came around the bend, she heard a whisper of sound that she realized too late was an incantation, and a jet of white light struck her uninjured arm squarely, knocking her sideways out of the way of another orange-colored spell and into the stone wall. She cried out as her broken wrist smacked against the stone and snapped her head in the direction of the curses, but all she was a wand tip poking out from around the corner. Rigel debated a split second whether she should rush her attacker and surprise them or not, but as a greenish-yellow spell struck the ground near where she stood, she took off at a run in the opposite direction. Some might call her a coward, but although Quile had finally taught them a shielding charm that Wednesday, she had yet to get it to work, and didn't fancy trying it against an enemy of unknown power and skill, though admittedly terrible aim, when she had the advantage of home territory. She was careful not to lead her pursuer, for she could easily hear their footsteps echoing behind her as she ran toward the common room, but instead made them chase her through the labyrinth of tunnels beyond the potions classrooms, where not even the Slytherins would have any reason to go. Luckily, the house elves still cleaned this part of the castle, or her attacker could have easily followed her dusty footprints through the maze. As it was, 10 minutes later she was sure she'd lost them, and she circled around the long way back toward the common room as quickly and quietly as she could. By the time she made it through the false wall, it was way past curfew. That didn't mean no one was awake. It was a Friday night, after all, and the common room was packed. She cringed internally as every head in the room turned toward her entrance, painfully aware of how sweaty and disheveled she must look after hours of polishing and running through the castle. Some of the other students stared at her, obviously curious at who was just getting back so long after curfew and why they looked like they'd run from the North Tower. "Rigel, over here." Draco and Pansy held their hands up so she could see them, and some of the other first years grouped by one of the fireplaces, and Rigel gratefully stumbled over and sunk into one of the low-backed chairs. Now that she was drained of fear and adrenaline, her body began to take stock of itself. Her injured wrist throbbed dully as her pulse skittered over it, but her attention was pulled toward her other arm, where a sharper, newer pain was localized. Shaking back her sleeve gingerly, she realized the white spell that landed on her upper arm had been a stinging hex. The skin from Rigel's bicep to her lower forearm was swollen and red. The skin felt tight and itchy, like a mosquito bite magnified to cover her entire arm. She'd never been attacked by a dozen bees at once, but she imagined the effect was about the same. "Merlin," Rigel not leaned over in his seat to get a better look. "What happened?" Pansy demanded, jumping up, seizing her sleeve, and pulling it up so she could tuck it into Rigel's collar and assess the damage. "You didn't jump in front of another curse, did you?" Draco asked. "Well, since you weren't there." "No." Rigel tried to laugh but it came out shaky. "Ow, Pan, don't poke it, it burns when you do that." Pansy blew out a breath and shook her head regretfully. "Well, it's definitely a stinging hex. Nothing to do but wait till it disperses." "Was it the butterfly?" Zabinai asked softly from his seat next to her. "I didn't see their face." Rigel gritted her teeth as Pansy prodded her arm again. "You were shot at from behind," Draco exclaimed in outrage, drawing curious looks from the groups of students sitting closest to their circle. "Didn't you at least turn and look at the coward? They were shooting from behind me and out of sight by sticking their wand around the corner." "That's why I was only hit once." "Terrible aim," Rigel said. "That, and I didn't stick around until they got me with something worse." "You ran away," Not chuckled. "Good form, back." Rigel smiled slightly in rueful acknowledgement. They couldn't keep up in the dungeons, so it definitely wasn't another Slytherin. "Probably a Gryffindor," Draco grumbled, "only they'd be stupid enough to chase you through the dungeons." Adrian Pusey ambled over to their circle to see what the commotion was about. What's this, Black? You were attacked by a Gryffindor outside the common room. His question was loud, and even in the noisy common room it garnered other Slytherins' attention. Attacked? One of our first years. They wouldn't dare. We don't know it was a Gryffindor, Rigel said, but she was ignored. The mutterings grew louder and more students came over to have a look at Rigel's arm, which Pansy prevented her from covering up embarrassedly. She felt crowded and hemmed in, and as Draco recounted what she'd told her friends to the listening crowd, it seemed that no one wanted to hear that it wasn't a big deal, and that she could take care of herself. Pusey dropped a hand on her shoulder and said, "It's out of your hands now. No one tries to gut a snakelet in our own dungeons, even if your family is a bunch of blood traitors." Rigel sighed and stood pointedly when the discussion turned toward revenge. "See you guys tomorrow," she nodded to Pansy and Draco before pushing her way gingerly through the crowd, trying to ignore the assessing stares coming her way from all corners of the room. Great, more eyes. Rigel went to bed uncomfortable, which was becoming the usual for her, though she knew the stinging hex would wear off in an hour or so, long before she woke the next morning. She had narrowed her attacker's identity down to the other 3 houses, at least, but somehow, with one wrist throbbing and the other arm burning, it didn't feel like much of an accomplishment. The weather was pleasantly cool the next day, with a cloudless sky and no wind to speak of. In other words, it was a perfect day for Quidditch. Draco grinned at them over lunch on Saturday. He was piling his plate with energy-rich foods and alternatively turning his head from side to side as he addressed his running monologue to first Rigel, then Pansy, checking to see that they were as excited as they'd been 30 seconds ago. "Of course, there won't be any tailwind, but since I'm not trying out for a position that only flies in one direction, it wouldn't be much advantage for me anyway." He paused with a spoonful of carrots hovering over his plate, realized with a bemused quirk of his eyebrows that there was no room left on his, and magnanimously turned to dump them onto Rigel's. "You like vegetables," he told her cheerfully. He then dug into the feast he'd compiled as gracefully as anyone with that much food could. "Aren't you afraid you'll get sick, eating all that?" Pansy asked, clearly thinking the Malfoy scion had been replaced with some kind of bourgeois doppelganger with only the bare skeletons of table manners. "Seekers will probably try out last," Rigel said, seeing that Draco had his mouth full, "so he'll have time to digest some of it beforehand, and if they play a real game there's no telling how long he might be in the air." And Draco added, "When he came up for air, or at least pumpkin juice, a Malfoy never gets sick." Pansy and Rigel shared a fond look. 10 minutes later, Flint stood lazily from his seat down the table. This was apparently the cue for all the other would-be players to follow him out of the hall like sycophantic courtiers, and the Slytherin table began emptying as curious spectators followed the procession as well. "Well, this is it." Draco set his utensils down deliberately and flashed them a confident, poster boy grin. "Don't bother wishing me luck." He stood dramatically, but paused to look down at them expectantly before heading off. "You guys are coming to watch, right?" "We'll be there," Pansy assured him. "In fact, we'll be cheering for you so loudly you'll be embarrassed to know us." Rigel raised an eyebrow to show that she had not been informed of such a plan, but Draco's eyes lit up like twin Lumos charms and he was obviously trying to stop his choreographed grin from becoming a beaming smile of Hufflepuffian affection, so she merely nodded her agreement. "Okay," Draco said, "I have to go get ready, then. Come soon so you don't miss anything important." He left the Great Hall at a pace that would be called a run, if he weren't a Malfoy. 11 years of good breeding out the window as soon as Quidditch is mentioned. Pansy smiled. "Boys." Rigel remembered just in time that it would be strange if she nodded in agreement, so instead she returned, with what she hoped was the appropriate amount of amused disgust, "Girls." Pansy laughed, but then her cheerful demeanor retreated, and she glanced sideways at Rigel while toying with her teacup saucer. "Rigel, where were you this morning?" "You don't have to tell me," Pansy added before Rigel could open her mouth. "I know you do your own things sometimes, but you've hardly disappeared at all this week, so I just wondered." She trailed off, embarrassed at the weak, rambling quality of her voice. Rigel swallowed her bite of carrots. Well, she did like vegetables, slowly, trying to decide how to answer. It should have been easy, she had an excuse already planned, but she wanted to lie as little as possible. She hadn't thought about how suspicious it would be for her to go off in disguise to work on the essays she'd gotten from Flint at breakfast that morning after spending all week fairly glued to Pansy and Draco's sides to avoid the eyes. "I was in the library," Rigel said. "That's where I go on the weekends. It's not to work on any of our assignments, I do those with you and Draco, it's just extra research I do on top of our studies, which I didn't think would interest you guys." Pansy nodded slowly, and Rigel guessed she was trying to take her words as the truth. "I thought you were kicked out of the library," Pansy said quietly, blushing at her blunt query. "I was, but I found a way around it," Rigel said. "I promise I don't have some exciting, secret life that I'm hiding from you and Draco because I want to have all the fun to myself. It really is quite boring work." Rigel told herself that it wasn't really a lie, since the secret parts of her life were too serious and dangerous to be exciting, but it felt weak even in her head. "Is it potions research?" Pansy asked. "Some of it," she admitted, thinking, "technically not a lie. I'm also trying to figure out what's going on with my magic. Complete lie. I don't fancy another detention like last night's." "Also true." Rigel made a face at the memory and Pansy graciously allowed the conversation to be steered away from extracurricular activities. "That's right, we never asked you how it went because of all the excitement last night." "Was it awful?" "Tell you on the way to the pitch," Rigel said, standing and offering her arm to Pansy for the walk. "If we're not there by the time the chasers start, Draco will fret." They made their way down to the stadium and found seats in the stands with the other spectators. It looked like Flint had just ordered everyone trying out to take a lap around the pitch, and was separating them into maybes and no way in hells. Those who flew terribly enough to get cut so quickly joined the students watching in the stands, and since none of them looked terribly downcast, Rigel assumed they hadn't been too serious in trying out. Flint called the chasers and keepers to try out first, simultaneously, and Pansy waved excitedly to Draco as he made his way to the side of the pitch with the other Slytherins who were trying for Beta or Seeker. By the end of the chaser-keeper round of tryouts, it was looking likely that Flint intended to keep the same team as last year, and that he was merely observing formality. He picked the same 3 chasers, including Pusey, who waved smugly at them as he left to change, and keeper from the old team, and the potential beaters and seekers were looking less enthusiastic as the captain called them forward. Draco, though, strode right out onto the pitch, confident smile in place and head held at just the right angle for the sunlight to catch his silver eyes brilliantly. Pansy laughed at their friend's artful posturing and cheered loudly, elbowing Rigel into clapping and smiling along. Draco tossed his head like the pureblood stallion she was sure he'd been frequently compared to in contemptuous answer and winked at them. The sounds of Pansy and Rigel's sarcastic clapping was immediately drowned out by the sound of Greengrass, Davis, and several girls from second year sighing and squealing and generally giggling like twits from 2 rows in front of them. Rigel and Pansy shared an amused glance at Draco's slightly surprised expression. He clearly hadn't expected the girls in their grade to take his playful, self-mocking flirtation seriously. He shrugged it off, however, and turned to listen to Flint explain the drill. There would be 4 bludgers let loose, to preserve the game ratio for the 8 beaters trying out, and to make the scrimmage go faster there would be 3 snitches released to occupy the 3 seekers. Whichever seeker caught the first snitch won, and the beaters were responsible for knocking bludgers toward both the seekers and each other, so it was also a test of maneuvering abilities for all the players. Rigel thought it sounded much more dangerous than a regular game, with no chasers to distract the beaters, and therefore much more challenging. She almost wished she could have tried out, now. Flint blew his whistle after all the balls had been released and all 14 players took to the air. "Do you think he'll get it?" Pansy asked, her clear blue eyes narrowed against the sun. "He's only a first year, after all." "It seems like a straightforward competition for Seeker," Rigel said, "so if he catches it first it'll be hard to deny him a spot." "Yeah." They lapsed into silence as they both tracked Draco's figure through the skies. He was in good form, Rigel thought, trying to be objective. Their practices, and her deliberately wild aim, had given Draco great skill at changing directions quickly, so he was able to avoid the bludgers fairly easily, and his strategy seemed to involve sticking closely to Higgs, the veteran seeker. No one was having any luck searching for the snitch, however, as the chaos of 4 bludgers and 8 beaters, not to mention so many people looking for the snitch at once, meant that everyone was interrupted in their search every other minute. There was something naturally elegant about Draco on a broom, though. almost as if he had been born to fly, and his grace on the earth was the true marvel. 20 minutes later, Pansy sighed and sat back against the seats behind them. Well, I tried. I've been very supportive and patient, and now I'm bored. Rigel, entertain me. Rigel spoke without taking her eyes from the drill. What's there to be bored about? We've seen about 5 near-deadly accidents so far. I don't think you can call them accidents if someone is purposely aiming a big steel ball at you and hoping you fall 50 feet to the ground. And as a human being, not to mention a Slytherin, you're supposed to be vastly entertained by mindless bloodshed. Rigel finished as if the blonde girl hadn't interrupted. She only looked away from the pseudo-match when a third voice broke into their friendly banter. Now, I object to the mindless part of that, Flint said, nudging a couple of third years out of his way so he could sit next to them on the bench. I'll have you know this violence serves a very important purpose. And what is that? Rigel asked politely, ignoring the looks Pansy was shooting her, knowing without looking that her friend wanted to know why Flint, a 5th year and Quidditch captain besides, was talking to them. This little spectacle, while dangerous beyond reason and pretty much useless in helping to determine Quidditch potential, is part of a brilliant campaign of misinformation that is vital to our team's success, Flint explained after settling into the seat next to Rigel and training his eyes toward the chaos happening above their heads. Pansy gave a polite cough and leaned around Rigel to say, "What do you mean by that, Mr. Flint?" Flint gave a bark of his harsh laughter at the Mr. and merely nudged Rigel to explain for him, still watching the players wheeling about in the air intently. Rigel shot Pansy a small smile, saying, "Flint means he thinks the other houses will send spies to our tryouts. When they see this nonsense, they'll think all the Slytherin players are crazy demons with broomsticks, and their morale will drop, which will do half of the Slytherin team's work for them come game time. Scare tactics, Mr. Flint." Pansy chuckled appreciatively. "How devious." Rigel saw Flint cut his eyes over toward the blonde first year out of the corner of her eye. "Just Flint," he said lowly, "and devious has got nothing to do with it. People deserve to have their expectations met, I figure, and one glimpse of this will vindicate the Gryffindor's every assumption about violent, bloodthirsty Slytherins." "Then you may call me Pansy," she said, hesitating, but deciding it would be too awkward to offer her hand around Rigel's torso. Flint grunted, "At least you don't giggle." Pansy seemed to take this as a great compliment, and smiled with self-satisfaction as she settled back in her seat. "Don't act like you're not also hoping someone runs and tells Wood about this," Rigel said, glancing over at the captain's hard profile. Flint smirked. "Smart money says old Wood'll be having his team practice with 4 bludgers within the week. With any luck, one of those chasers gets too injured to play, and we wipe the floor with them." Rigel frowned as something struck her. "So this whole tryout's just a farce? You'll be picking the old team no matter what?" "Why not?" Flint shrugged unconcernedly as he watched the poor, hopeless souls battle it out in vain to further the team's consequence. "Already got a good team, and the players are young, so there's no need to add new blood for a couple years." Rigel looked over at Pansy to see she was looking just as miserably back at her. "Draco will be so disappointed," she thought. Just then, one of the players went into a steep dive. Just as she had identified the flyer as Higgs, another player on the other side of the field dived as well. Both players were weaving between beaters, dodging bludgers, and the heads in the crowd moved rapidly back and forth between the two of them as it became clear that neither was fainting. "That's Draco," Pansy said excitedly, pointing to the second diving figure. Rigel caught a better look as the player leveled out to follow his snitch's new trajectory and smiled at the sight of familiar, silver blonde hair and fluid skill in maneuvering the broom. Even though she knew it wouldn't make a difference, Rigel inwardly cheered her friend on. Pansy didn't bother with inwardly and yelled wildly for Draco to go faster because he was so close. The first seeker, Higgs, caught his snitch just a hair's breadth before Draco did, and Flint immediately blew his whistle and left the stands to meet with the players on the pitch, briefly waving off Pansy's faint-hearted farewell as he went. Rigel patted Pansy's arm as they swallowed their disappointment on Draco's behalf and waited in silence for Flint to dismiss the players. Whatever the captain had to say evidently didn't take long, and soon those who'd tried out were groaning and gathering their equipment, some angrily, some dejectedly, and heading back to the castle to clean up. Rigel and Pansy lagged behind the rest of the spectators as they filled out, and soon they caught sight of a sweaty, red-faced Malfoy moving quickly up the stairs toward them. Draco dropped his broom when he was close enough and launched himself at them. He ended up half sprawled across Rigel's lap, with one arm around her neck and the other around Pansy's shoulder. Pansy yelped and even Rigel stiffened with surprise, but neither pushed him off when he buried his face between their shoulders and gasped for air. "Can you believe it?" he panted, his voice distorted with fatigue and emotional upset. "I know," Pansy said, patting his head soothingly, "it's quite ridiculous." "Flint's an ass," Rigel agreed. "What?" Draco pulled back with a confused look on his sweaty face. "What?" Pansy and Rigel echoed, dumbly. Draco didn't look nearly as torn up as they'd expected. "Well, whatever, isn't it great?" he beamed, "I made the team." They stared at him blankly, both trying to rewire their responses according to this influx of contradictory information. "What?" Draco deflated a bit, still panting slightly, but looking more put out by the second. "It's only Reserve Seeker, but it's still pretty." Rigel was the first to catch up with the situation and she smiled suddenly into Draco's confused face, causing him to unintentionally lose his train of thought. She used her right arm to return his awkward half-hug with an equally awkward half-hug of her own, and said, "Draco, that's awesome. We thought, well, it looked like Flint wasn't adding any new players to the team." She shrugged and pulled back so Pansy, who was beaming herself now, could hug Draco in turn. He didn't. Draco was smiling again, one arm around each of them. If Rigel's other arm was usable she could have wrapped it around Pansy and formed a kind of huddle triangle. He picked all the same players as last year, but he said I had so much potential he was taking me on as a reserve, to train me up as Higgs' replacement. "Wow, Draco, that's really high praise coming from the captain," Pansy congratulated, stepping back to smooth her robes and reminding them they were in public. Draco and Rigel stepped back as well, and Draco said, "Well, he didn't say it exactly like that, but that's really what he meant." They laughed, and Draco retrieved his broom from where it had rolled under the bench in front of them. "Let's head back to the castle," Pansy suggested. "Draco, you can get cleaned up, and Rigel can disappear mysteriously until dinner." Pansy winked at her to show she didn't really mind. "Well, it's not mysterious now," Pansy. Rigel sighed melodramatically. "I'll have to spend all afternoon with you guys, now, if only to preserve my air of unpredictability. Besides," she nudged Draco as they started out of the stands, "we have to celebrate our group's first monumental victory together. No disappearing until tomorrow, I promise." As they made their way up to the castle, Draco said casually, "Now that I'm on the team, I'll be watching the game from the player's box." Okay, Pansy was waiting for the punchline, but Rigel could already see where this was going. "Oh, Bew," she started, but Draco cut her off with practiced efficiency. "Not to worry, Rigel, my mother's invitation remains open, of course. I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time watching the first game with my parents even without my illustrious presence to invigorate you," he said, his bright smile turning much more sinister, at least in Rigel's mind. "But who will introduce us properly if you aren't even there when we meet?" she argued reasonably, shaking her head as if she could deny this new turn of events. Without Draco there to distract his mother, there was nothing to stop Mrs. Malfoy from noticing all the ways in which she was not like Sirius Black. It just wouldn't be proper. "Nonsense," Draco smirked, a little bounce in his step telling her how much he was enjoying making her uncomfortable. "Pansy gets along famously with my mother, or so I've heard. She can introduce you." "But I'm not going to the—" "Oh, yes you are," Rigel cut Pansy desperately. "You have to sit in that box with me, Pansy. Please, Pan." "Well, I suppose it would be alright, since I was invited originally anyway, and even if there are a limited number of seats reserved, Draco's just given up his." Pansy pursed her lips, "But a couple of hours of Quidditch, you'll owe me." "Done." Rigel nodded instantly. "Anything." "You make it sound like you're facing a dragon," Draco scowled. "I'll have you know my mother is perfectly nice to people who don't get on her bad side." "Introductions," Pansy decided. "I'll go with you if you give me a few hours tomorrow to introduce you to people I think you need to know." Rigel hesitated. She'd been hoping to avoid that as long as possible, not knowing how exactly she was going to navigate the myriad political and social waters of Slytherin House just yet, but there was no way she could face the Malfoys alone in just a few weeks. Her disguise hadn't been perfected, trained into her muscles and mind, yet, and then there was the matter of distracting from her broken wrist as well. Call it paranoia kicking in, But all it took was one mistake, one instant of thinking, oh, so-and-so probably won't notice that, or no one looks that closely, and then she, and Archie's entire fort came crumbling down. Deal, she said, choosing scrutiny from students over scrutiny by older, experienced snakes as the lesser of two dangers. All three of them now satisfied, the trio headed for the dungeons to celebrate Draco's victory in style. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. The next morning, Rigel, Draco, and Not woke to the sound of brisk knocking on their door. They were content to ignore it for a while, as all the first years had been up past midnight celebrating Draco's spot on the house team, but the knocking only got louder and more impatient, so they sat up and moved back their hangings, exchanging bleary-eyed looks and wondering that such audacious knocking existed in the world. Not checked the time, then cursed and flung himself back onto his bed. "Oh, hell, no," he muttered irritably. Draco and Rigel looked at each other, and Draco's eyes narrowed. "You're dressed. You get it." Apparently Draco's pajamas didn't count as dressed. Rigel supposed this was her punishment for sleeping in her clothes. She rolled out of bed and shivered as her bare feet met the cold dungeon floor. She padded her way to the door and cracked it to peer into the hall, intending to tell the knocker to go away and then go right back to sleep. Unfortunately for that plan, the person at the door was Pansy. She breezed past Rigel and cast the Lumos charm swiftly, drawing a groan from Not's bed and a sound of startled indignation from Draco when he caught sight of her. "Pans," he hastened to run his fingers through his hair and attempt to look dignified in his nightclothes, "you can't just barge into a gentleman's room first thing in the morning. And you," he scowled at Rigel, "the reason you answered the door and not us is because you're already decent. If you let the person in, it defeats the purpose." Rigel rolled her eyes. "I answered the door because you guys were too lazy to, and besides, a gentleman never refuses a lady. Not to mention the fact that a lady never gives a gentleman the chance to," Pansy said. "Why are you here, Parkinson?" Not's voice was muffled by his pillow. "I'm here to get Rigel ready for breakfast," she said, as if her every motive was readily transparent. "And Rigel can't dress himself because—" Draco glanced pointedly at Rigel. "Oh, wait, he's already dressed, so please come back later." Pansy gave Rigel's clothes a dubious once-over. "I'm sure he could, normally, but today we're doing introductions after breakfast, and I need him to look like a pureblood heir." "He is a pureblood heir." Draco rolled his eyes, "so however he looks must be how one is supposed to look." "Of course," Pansy said, "but visual clues will reinforce his consequence for those who are too stupid to think for themselves." "You're introducing me to stupid people?" Rigel asked. "Well, no, but," Pansy set her jaw and strode toward Rigel menacingly, "since I'm the one doing the introduction, your image reflects on me. Is this how you thank me for going out on a social limb for you?" She gestured exasperatedly at Rigel's wrinkled clothes, which would have hurt if Rigel hadn't been planning on changing after she showered anyway. Even she didn't wear the same clothes 2 days in a row. "But breakfast doesn't even start for 2 whole hours," Not said. "Perfection takes time," Pansy said. "I will let you stay as long as you stop quoting my mother," Draco groaned, "and be quiet so the rest of us can sleep another couple hours." Not cheered weakly and shut his hangings immediately. "What about me?" Rigel gazed imploringly at Draco. Yeah, that's too bad about your beauty sleep." Draco settled back into his bed and closed his curtains as well, leaving Rigel at the questionable mercy of her other friend. "Now, Pansy, I'm sure I can make myself presentable if you give me a chance," Rigel tried, backing away slowly. "Well, after I show you what I want, you can try all by yourself next time." Pansy smiled the way one might smile at a precocious child. "Don't look so scared, this is going to be fun." Rigel was going to get Pansy a dictionary for Christmas, for in no way did the next 2 hours resemble fun. First Pansy sent Rigel off to the shower, with instructions to wash everything but her hair, and gave her a set of clothes she was to change into after drying off. These weren't the clothes she would be wearing, of course. These were what Pansy called control clothes, which would act as a passive backdrop for trying out various hairstyles and save the real clothes from getting wrinkles or water spots before they were ready to be worn. Rigel showered. She scrubbed and washed and was generally grateful Pansy hadn't insisted on being involved in this particular part of the process. She carefully held her left wrist out of the spray, and when she was done she wrapped it with clean bandages she had hidden under the sink. The control clothes weren't too bad, loose and comfortable, with sleeves long enough to hide her new bandages, and when she opened the bathroom door, Pansy was waiting with a basket of products so numerous they couldn't possibly all be for different things. She pushed Rigel back into the bathroom and onto the stool in front of the sink so she could wash her hair. Rigel actually liked getting her hair washed. It was strangely comforting. She was sure Pansy had put more than shampoo and cream rinse in it, but she had decided not to ask questions, and instead sat as passively as she could as Pansy rinsed, repeated, or whatever she was doing to her hair. Once it was washed, Pansy arranged the short locks about her head and performed a charm that would keep the hair perfectly still as it dried naturally. "Never let anyone use a heat charm on your hair," she told Rigel firmly. "It'll wreak havoc on your ends, and the texture is too wild to take a blowout well." Rigel nodded very seriously, and Pansy moved on to her nails. She took Rigel's right hand and started inspecting her cuticles, but Rigel snatched it back frantically. Pansy gave her a stern look. "You have to have clean nail beds, or no one will trust you." Rigel raised an eyebrow in patent disbelief. "It's true," Pansy insisted. "People associate cleanliness with trustworthiness, because clean money is less risk than dirty money, and people associate immorality with the unwashed masses." "Some people associate immorality with Slytherins," Rigel pointed out. "That doesn't make them right." "We're trimming your cuticles and that's that," Pansy said. "Teach me how to do it," then Rigel suggested. "It's too girly if I sit here and let you do it." Pansy rolled her eyes. "Boys. Okay, fine, I'll do one hand and you can do the other." Rigel immediately presented Pansy with her right hand, grinning inside at how perfectly it had worked out. Rigel wouldn't have been able to use her left hand to do her right hand anyway. Pansy finished Rigel's right side and then watched her carefully work on her left hand. Rigel was sure to keep the sleeve covering everything but the fingertips of her hand as she worked, and in the end Pansy was satisfied, if a little bemused. Next, Pansy attacked her eyebrows. "Not a lot," she promised, brandishing the tweezers to make her point. "Yours aren't actually that bad. Just a few hairs off of each end so they look natural, but not messy." Rigel grimaced through the whole thing, but she didn't go so far as to refuse. Pansy leaned back to inspect her work, and sighed. "I do wish your eyes weren't so flat." She suddenly blushed, as if she'd not meant to say that out loud. "Not that they aren't nice, Rigel. Just. I think I remember hearing that your father's eyes sparkled a bit, or something." "It's okay," Rigel shrugged. "If you want, I'll put in eye drops right before you introduce me." Pansy grinned at the idea. "I can see it now. Your lost puppy look would be about 10 times as effective if your eyes glistened every so slightly. I wouldn't even have to say a word." "I thought I wasn't allowed to do that anymore," Rigel said. "Well, not to us, but with the older Slytherins, particularly these two, it can't hurt to have an ace up your sleeve," Pansy allowed. At that point Rigel was allowed out of the bathroom so that she could sit on her bed while Pansy rummaged through her closet. Archie had all kinds of clothes, most of which Rigel hadn't even looked at except to hang them up when Draco scolded her about leaving perfectly good fabrics in the stale air of her trunk. Pansy squealed with delight when she saw all the different robes she had to work with, and she immediately began taking out different colors to hold up against Rigel's skin tone. Most of them worked fine, since she and Archie were of a color, but a few of the more outlandish robes drew horrified glances from her blonde friend. "My dad has a disreputable sense of humor," she explained when Pansy came across a particularly garish robe of lime green with orange and yellow striped trimming. It had flowers in a pattern along the border, but where the flower petals would usually be, there were fish heads instead. "He and my uncles have matching sets," she admitted, smiling wryly as she remembered the occasion they'd been commissioned for. Her father, James, had been forced to attend the wedding of a particularly boorish co-worker, and Sirius had seized upon the opportunity to make everyone think twice about inviting the marauders anywhere. She had no idea why Archie had even packed them. "Well, I suppose it would be an excellent icebreaker." Pansy gingerly tucked the monstrosity into the back of the closet, "but not quite what I had in mind for today. Now this, on the other hand, should do quite nicely." She held up a set of casual robes that looked regular black to the shallow eye, but were in fact a very dark gray. They were perfect for weekend wear, but the material was a bit thin, so Rigel had avoided them so far. It wasn't that she had anything to hide in the chest department yet, just that she was afraid to wear anything that would make her look even more delicate. She had to admit, however, that the robes would strike a perfect tone of effortless sophistication. Pansy shooed her off to the bathroom to change once more, with strict instructions not to muss her hair, easier said than done while trying to pull robes on one-handed, but she managed, while Pansy decided on shoes. When she came back out, Draco had finally woken back up and was watching with amusement as Pansy scowled fiercely at a pile of Rigel's shoes, all of which were, apparently, rejects. Shoes were the only thing Rigel and Archie had kept their own, mostly because Archie's feet were 2 sizes bigger than hers, and it simply wouldn't have worked. She shut the bathroom door behind her and found herself the new focus of Pansy's ire. "Just what are these things supposed to be?" the girl demanded. "Shoes," Rigel said, biting back the word obviously with difficulty. "They don't match anything here," she nearly wailed, "and they're bulky. They are protected against most types of acid," Rigel informed her, "not to mention fireproof, waterproof, and resistant to corrosion." Yes, I'm sure they are very serviceable," Pansy sighed, "but they don't go with the robes I picked out." "I could wear different robes," Rigel said, though inwardly dreading having to drag another pair of robes on and off around her injury. "No, don't be ridiculous," Pansy turned to Draco, "we'll have to borrow some of yours." "You, what?" Draco stared at Pansy. "You want my shoes?" "Not me, Rigel," Pansy said soothingly, "just for the morning. I'll see them cleaned myself before they are returned, and of course you're welcome to demand a similar favor in return." "I seriously doubt I'll be asking to borrow your shoes anytime soon, Pansy, thanks though." Draco rolled his eyes, "and I can see to my own shoe cleaning." "So you agree?" "Great." Pansy nearly dove for his closet in her joy, "because I noticed you wearing a dove grey pair last week that would be just perfect." "If they fit," Rigel said quietly. "He's right," Draco grimaced, "I haven't quite grown into my size yet, you see, and... oh, but these are tiny." Pansy pulled out the shoes she wanted, but eyed them sadly. "They're almost as small as mine are. I'm not sure these will fit at all." Rigel was actually surprised, for she had been expecting the opposite problem. One of the good things about her shoes was that they added the appearance of extra length and breadth to her feet, which were smaller than she thought a boy's should be. If Draco had small feet too, however, there might not be a problem. She reached absently to take the shoes from Pansy, along with the socks that had been approved for her outfit, and set to trying them on. They fit almost perfectly. To Pansy's surprise and Draco's pleasure, it seemed he wasn't the only boy with small feet in their year. They were a bit wider than her foot, but the length was good, and even Rigel could see that they contrasted nicely with the dark robes. "Oh, yes." Pansy circled Rigel happily, "Now there's a perfect note of symmetry between your eyes and your shoes." "Doesn't he look pure-blooded, Draco?" "He looks rich and refined, if that's what you mean." Draco shrugged. "I certainly wouldn't think him out of place at one of Mother's casual luncheons." Rigel fidgeted uncomfortably while they discussed how pure-blooded she looked. She had never felt her deception more keenly than that moment. The mirror she was looking into might as well have been a painting. She couldn't see herself anywhere in the grey eyes, the perfectly arranged curls, the elegant robes that Harriet Potter had always considered too impractical, and the shoes, oh, Merlin, those shoes, which she could never take anywhere near a cauldron. For a moment she was terrified. Is this what it means to chase your dreams? Do you have to sacrifice your real self to find your would-be self? And even if you find it, and all your dreams become the facts of your reality, is there a way to get back to that dreamer unchanged? She didn't know, and that thought was enough to hold her thinking altogether. "Will you take this charm off of my hair now, Pan?" Rigel asked. "It's making my head feel a bit heavy, I think." "Yes, it should be dry by now." Pansy lifted the charm and used her fingers to tweak the positioning of a couple of the dark locks. "Perfect. I'm afraid there's nothing more for me to do." Draco sighed as he helped Rigel put all her shoes back into her closet neatly. "I'm sure we'll miss you terribly, but don't let the door hit you on the way out." Pansy sniffed. "Well, it's a good thing breakfast starts in 15 minutes then, so you won't be bereft of my company for longer than it will take to wake Not from his coma." She gathered up her products quickly, and the warning glance she sent Rigel as she paused by the door veritably dared her to change anything in her appearance before going to breakfast. Rigel smiled meekly. "Thank you, Pansy," she said as the blonde girl left. "I can't remember which of us made friends with her first," Draco said after Pansy had gone, "but we are going to have a long 7 years. Never dull, though Rigel smiled, and when people look at pictures of all the interesting things that happen in the next 7 years, you can rest assured that we'll at least be the best dressed ones in the frame. Draco smiled ruefully. I'm sure one day I'll appreciate that, but right now I just wish I could have slept some more. You? Rigel raised an eyebrow. What about me? Again, what about you? Draco grinned, and instead of arguing about which one of us got less sleep this morning, as if it's even up for dispute, we should be waking Theo up so that he can enjoy the fresh dungeon air as well. Rigel glanced over at Not's bed, which was eclipsed by hangings that probably muted light and sound, and from which steady, sickeningly comfortable breathing noises were emerging. It is almost time for breakfast, she said. That's the spirit. Draco grinned, practically doing him a favor, aren't we? 15 minutes later, Draco and Rigel met Pansy in the common room. Not was conspicuously absent. After taking in Rigel's wide-eyed, shell-shocked look and hearing Draco mutter, I thought he was a morning person while brushing futilely at a singed portion of his sleeve, Pansy decided not to ask, and they all three headed for breakfast. Rigel received several interesting looks from the girls in their grade over breakfast, the one from Bulstrode making her the least uncomfortable, as the solidly built girl seemed to be calculating something considerably less romantic than Davis and Greengrass were. Pansy kept sending her smug little see how much difference it makes smiles from across the table, and even Draco found the sight of their classmates ogling someone other than him to be a nice change. When the post came, Rigel received her long-awaited reply from Archie. It was delivered by a barn owl, so she opened it right away. Dear Rigel, I like the change by the way. I was so glad to receive your letter. I did miss you, no matter how annoying I think you are. Rigel rolled her eyes. Archie was about as bad at pretending to be her as she was pretending to be him, and it's good that you're doing well at Hogwarts so far, though why anyone would want to go to that pretentious place I really don't understand. Rigel thought he was laying it on a bit thick there. I'm glad you've made friends already, and it was really brave of you to befriend a Malfoy after all Dad and Uncle Sirius have told us about them. As for Marcus Flint, you did tell me about him, remember? I specifically recall you describing him to me as rough around the edges but much nicer than he looks when you told me about meeting him and his terrifyingly prejudiced father in the VIP box. You mentioned something about a troubled home life and a mother with a chronic illness, which was part of the reason you told him about your ambition to be a healer after your own mum passed, wasn't it? And said if I ever met him I should try and look past the surface, which you said is mostly just a front. Am I remembering that right? Anyway, he does seem nice, so perhaps I'll send him an owl and see if we can't all become good friends. My classes are going well, and my potions professor was especially impressed with my understanding of the art. I bet yours was too, considering how much of my knowledge must have rubbed off on you over the years. I don't think I'll have any problems becoming a healer here, and I hope you aren't too jealous of me. I'll share everything I learn with you over the summers, and it'll be like we're both in healer training. I'm sure by the time you graduate you'll be able to pass the healer certification tests with ease. I've also made a few friends, the closest of which is a muggle-born witch who's also from England, Hermione Granger. She's terrifyingly brilliant, but also very helpful and friendly, if a bit bossy at times. Well, that's really all I have to report so far. Sorry my reply took so long, I've been really busy settling in. Imagine I said something sappy and heartfelt about missing you, etc. Harry. Rigel smiled fondly as she folded up the letter and tucked it into her pocket. Archie was going to write Flint, it seemed, and hopefully he would cement an agreement from Flint to keep their secret indefinitely. Letter from my cousin, she explained when Draco and Pansy sent her politely questioning looks. Draco frowned thoughtfully. The Blacks are related to nearly all the old wizarding families, but I can't think of any with children old enough to write to who aren't here at Hogwarts. Did you mean an older cousin, who'd already graduated? Pansy coughed delicately. I think perhaps he meant a cousin attending a different magical school. But Hogwarts is the best, Draco said blankly. What family with connections to the Blacks would send their child anywhere else? Pansy sent Draco a meaningful look, at which he made a little O with his mouth and said, are they from the continent, then? You know, the Malfoys came over from France with the Norman conquest, and a lot of old wizarding roots can be found in ancient European civilizations. Rigel smiled a bit stiffly. No, my cousin is not from the continent. My cousin attends the American Institute of Magic. Rigel could see the exact moment Malfoy realized that the only British magical children who went to America were those who could not attend Hogwarts because of their blood status. The blonde boy looked surprised, then faintly embarrassed, that Rigel had been openly corresponding with someone tainted by Muggle. Pansy sighed at Draco's uncomfortable expression and Rigel's stiffly unapologetic posture, but wisely did not presume to interfere. So Draco cast around for something non-inflammatory to say. He valued blood and magic as any good Malfoy should, but he valued his friendship with Rigel, too, and everyone knew of her father's unfortunate political leanings, so, that would be the Potter heir, then. You two must have spent some time together as children, with your fathers so close in school. Yes, Rigel relaxed slightly when Draco didn't immediately hurl ugly slurs around. She berated herself for not giving her friend more credit. So far he had said nothing against her or Sirius, despite the reputation she knew the last two blacks had in Slytherin House. She promised she'd give Draco a chance to be fair-minded before she assumed too much about his reactions to things. Harry and I grew up together. Harriet Potter goes by Harry. Pansy asked curiously, what's she like? I've heard her mentioned in our tea circle, of course, by those who saw her as a baby, before the Potters and the Blacks stepped out of society. Rigel thought that was a very diplomatic way of describing how the Potters and Blacks, along with about 50 other Dumbledore-aligned families at the time, had angrily turned their backs on pure-blooded society altogether in a politically motivated snub known as the Great Split of 1981. On Halloween night, 1981, Mr. Riddle had launched a secret coup of the Wizengamot, that is, he had gathered enough supporters from council members he allegedly bribed to call a secret meeting around midnight, while most of the light-supporting council members were out celebrating and therefore mysteriously and unfortunately missed their summons to the council. Using the absence of most of his opposition, Mr. Riddle had ruthlessly pushed through a series of laws, which included in their number restrictions against anyone schooled outside of the UK from holding high office in government or publicly run companies in Great Britain, laws forbidding any witch or wizard with creature blood from voting in public elections or enlisting in any law enforcement agency, and laws to keep the Wizengamot from overturning any already sanctioned law with less than a 3/4 majority. The families whose council members had been excluded from the vote were outraged, and in silent, furious protest they had to one-cut the rest of pure-blooded society, mostly consisting of dark purebloods, altogether. Never since then had any of the offended light families attended a social event hosted by the wife or child of one of the heads of family who had been present that Halloween evening. It was an incredibly sore point for most of the dark pureblood hostesses, who suddenly had half the attendees at their balls and luncheons, but Pansy managed to reference it casually, as if the Great Split had not affected her at all. Does she really have eyes as green as a serpent's finely polished scales? Pansy asked. Draco and Rigel turned disbelieving looks on her. Pansy's cheeks became ever so slightly rose-tinted. What? She shrugged artlessly. The Potter heir was a baby last time anyone saw her, so all they can talk about is the color of her hair and eyes. But, Draco broke off to suppress a snort of laughter, then raised his eyebrows. Who says they are green as a serpent's whatever? Pansy rolled her eyes. Don't laugh, you know how my mother is. She thinks she's a tortured soul, but her turn of phrase rubs off on me every now and then. Draco nodded in understanding, but his eyes still gleamed with mirth. Oh, just answer my question, Rigel, Pansy said. Rigel cocked her head, wondering if she'd be able to talk about herself as if she were someone else. She found it was easier if she used Harry or Harriet to describe her real self, and Rigel to refer to her alter ego, when she was trying to keep everything straight in her head. Not that Rigel wasn't just as much her real self, she hoped it would get easier in time, but worried that she'd have multiple identities by the time she was 17. Well, Rigel began, Harry's eyes are definitely green. She takes after her dad's coloring, mostly, but everyone says her eyes are her mom's. Lily Potter Evans, right? Pansy said, looking contemplative. They say she was quite lovely. She still is, Rigel said evenly. Aunt Lily is one of those people that never seems to age a day. My mother is the same way, Draco smiled. Then he paused, a small frown on his face as he wondered at the ease with which he compared Narcissa Black with a woman of Muggle birth. The mark of true beauty, Pansy said wisely. Were you and Harriet close as children? Yes, Rigel said, hesitating before saying, my Uncle Remus didn't have any children, so she was my only friend, before I met you two. Rigel thought that even from Archie's position it was true, if you didn't count Marcus Flint. They had been the only children of an age in their part of Godric's Hollow, since most of the inhabitants were elderly, like their neighbor Mrs. Bagshot. Pansy and Draco looked torn between pleasure at being considered two of her closest three friends, and sadness at how isolated Rigel's life had been compared to theirs. The consequence of the Light family's stepping out of pure-blooded society was that, without attending the teas and structured play dates designed to socialize heirs, their children consorted mostly with their neighbors and siblings, and didn't meet many other wizarding children until they came to Hogwarts. You must have been more like siblings than friends, then Pansy said thoughtfully. We were, Rigel said. Harry's like my little sister, or maybe older sister, the way she mothers me sometimes. Rigel was able to admit this easily. Archie needed to be mothered, in her opinion. Does she want to be a potions mistress as well? Draco asked, curious about this unknown Potter despite himself. Sort of, Rigel said, trying to figure out how to set up their story in a way that wouldn't be contradicted later. She does have a strong interest in potions, but I think she's planning on applying that interest toward healer studies at the moment. AIM has a fast-track program for getting a healing certificate. It's very competitive, and they drop students who can't keep up with the extra workload all the time, but Harry's very determined. Rigel thought that was the best explanation. This way, if someone learned that Harry had been very interested in potions before leaving for school, it was explained, and when Archie and Harry eventually switched their lives back, they would say that Harry simply decided healing wasn't for her at the last minute. Archie would take the Mediwizard exam under his own name once they'd graduated, saying that he'd been inspired by Harry's studies over the years, and decided to learn healing on the side, easily accepted considering the amount of time Rigel would be spending in the library while she was at Hogwarts. The trickiest part of the plan was convincing everyone that Archie was in fact Archie after he came back to claim his name, and a generation of people in English Wizarding Society thought that Archie looked like Rigel. Rigel would have no trouble becoming Harry again, because no one from America was likely to connect the boy Harry Potter with the girl Harriet Potter, simply because none of them moved in the pure-blood circles who would know better, being half or muggle-born. Archie's reappearance hadn't been entirely worked out yet, but Rigel was confident she could come up with something in the next 6 years or so. A Mediwitch. That's quite noble, Pansy said. Though it might be hard for her to get a good job here in England if she was schooled out of the United Kingdom, Draco added. Pansy sent him a repressing look, which he shrugged off. Well, it's true, even if some people think it's unfair. He's right, Rigel said. I think Harry will work something out, though. Like becoming a potions mistress and working for private development companies. Will she remain in America, then? Pansy asked. Maybe, Rigel shrugged, even I'm not privy to all her plans. I thought you two were such close friends, Draco said. Rigel hoped he wasn't honestly jealous, and that the question had come out spitefully on accident. Well, you and I are friends just as much, and I don't know all of you guys' plans, Rigel said. Point taken, Pansy laughed, and furthered by the fact that we definitely don't know anything about your plans, Rigel. What are you talking about? Rigel finished off her tea neatly. I want to be a potions master. That's really all there is to me. Her friends exchanged dry looks, but then Pansy realized that people were beginning to leave the Great Hall and quickly removed her napkin from her lap so she could stand. Oh, let's get back to the common room quickly, she said, motioning for Rigel and Draco to leave their plates as well. I told the people I want you to meet that we would be in the common room after breakfast, and we have to be there before them or we'll be seen as impertinent, making an upperclassman wait. They got back to the dungeons with plenty of time for Pansy to settle Rigel's short, dark locks one last time and arrange the three of them in seats by one of the fireplaces with extra chairs around it, trying to strike a mood of casual repose, or so she said. Now, I've known these two since I was a child, and their personalities can be a bit, well, I hope you like them, but don't take offense if they say anything needling, they like to provoke people sometimes. Rigel nodded a bit apprehensively. Why am I here again? Draco asked while they waited. He was sitting to Rigel's left on a low-backed couch, and Pansy was sitting in a chair that was placed cat-eye corner to the end of the couch Draco sat on. This left an open space next to Rigel on the couch, and placed her closest to the empty chairs that would be taken by the upperclassmen. This was supposed to show that Draco and Pansy weren't trying to hide or protect Rigel, and that Rigel was not afraid to be the closest open target for a group of more powerful, and possibly hostile, strangers. Rigel was glad she had Pansy to work all this out for her. You are here to lend consequence to Rigel's standing in society. What better endorsement for the debut of the new Black family heir than the presence of the Malfoy family heir? Pansy explained patiently. You make it sound so mercenary. Pans. Draco wrinkled his nose. There's something unsavory about social maneuvering. Those at the top of the social food chain can afford to feel that way. Pansy smiled wryly, but others must reconcile themselves to the gentle game, no matter how repellent they find it to be at times. But you and Rigel aren't exactly bottom feeders, Draco said. Why is it so important to push him into society right now? It must be while he is at school, because when he is under his father's jurisdiction he can't participate in society unless Black Senior allows it. School is a place of social neutrality, as it must be if students whose parents are at political odds are expected to coexist peacefully, Pansy said, and the more Rigel presents himself to the other Slytherins openly, the less they'll have to form an opinion of him based on conjecture and hearsay. If we want our friendship with Rigel to be accepted, we have to show the people in our circles that he has nothing to hide. Draco glanced at Rigel apologetically, but he does have things to hide. Rigel shrugged. It was true. Well, what better way to hide things than by giving people no reason to go looking for them? Pansy said, her head tipped reasonably to the side. Draco sighed. Whatever you say, Pansy. They waited only another few minutes before Pansy stood gracefully and motioned surreptitiously for Draco and Rigel to do the same. They turned to face two older boys making their way toward them from a hallway across the common room. They were about the same height, but one was slightly taller. The taller one had light brown hair cut close to his head and a firm, square jaw that gave him a stern aura most of the time. The shorter, though still quite tall compared to Rigel, on the other hand, had hair so black it was almost blue, and honey-colored eyes that sparked with humor as they flicked lightly over the first years. He was thin and delicately built, looking like a playful shadow next to the rock statue that was his friend, but he was almost beautiful, too. Mr. Rookwood, Mr. Rosier, how good of you to join us. Pansy stepped forward with a smile that seemed to be at least in part genuine fondness. You have met Mr. Malfoy, I believe. The older Slytherins nodded politely to Draco, who nodded back. Then, may I introduce my classmate, Rigel Black? Pansy turned her head to indicate Rigel, who kept her eyes cool and steady as she received their regard. Rigel, this is Alden Rosier and Edmund Rookwood. How do you do, Mr. Black? Rosier, the slighter of the two, stepped forward to shake her hand easily, followed duly by Rookwood. Both handshakes were brief, but firm, and transferred a pleasant warmth despite the dungeon air. Very well, thank you. Rigel nodded to each of the older boys in turn, her face a mask of polite interest. Pansy sat first, followed by Malfoy, then Rookwood and Rosier, and finally Rigel. Rookwood chose the single seat opposite Pansy, and Rosier the one on the couch next to Rigel. She tried to both sit straight and lean back enough for Draco to not feel excluded from the conversation, though he had made it clear he wasn't particularly interested in the whole affair, and Rigel was grateful her injury was on her left side, and was unlikely to draw the scrutiny of the upperclassmen. Everything else about Rigel was, apparently, fair game. Pansy got the conversation started in true hostess style. I'm so pleased you found time in your schedules to sit down with me today. Her words were formal, but she injected such emotion into each syllable that it was hard to doubt them. It's been ages since we saw one another last, and I'm sure you're both quite busy now that the term is picking up. Not at all, Rookwood said. If a mountain had a voice, strong and staid, it would have been Rookwood's. He spoke with his eyelids half lowered, and the effect was like a transparency charm had been cast over everything his gaze touched. Indeed, I cannot think of anyone too busy to spend a few moments with you, Miss Parkinson. Though as lowly fourth years, our schedules are hardly hard-pressed to accommodate anything, Rosier added, winking overtly at Pansy, who to her credit accepted their flattery and cajoling with aplomb, like a queen accepting a beau. Draco laughed lightly, sounding much more engaged than he'd acted before the other two had arrived. Oh, don't tell her that, she'll be expecting Rigel and I to be equally accommodating with our time, now. And why shouldn't you be? Pansy asked, eyebrows raised playfully. Because you're impossible to live with if you get your way too often, Rigel said, thinking she might as well participate in the banter, since Pansy had gone to so much trouble to arrange everything. Rookwood and Rosier chuckled, and Draco nodded earnestly. He's right, you know. You really mustn't spoil our Pansy or she'll become entirely out of hand. A woman is always out of hand, Rosier said slyly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Though she may never be long out of mind, Rookwood added, leaning back into his chair, as if in counterbalance to Rosier. Pansy looked torn between pique at being singled out and relief that the ice was steadily breaking down. She settled for smiling good-naturedly and turning the subject once again. I take it your studies are progressing smoothly, then, if you've so much time to torment the female race, she said. They are, Rosier said, or at least as smoothly as can be expected before we settle into career paths. Are you considering anything in particular? Rigel asked. It wasn't hard to project interest into her question. Rookwood and Rosier were interesting people so far, at least on the surface. I think I would like to pursue a mastery in experimental theory at some point after graduation, Rosier said, but Edmund is more interested in hands-on work, aren't you? I find the minding of magical plants and animals to be more satisfying than arithmancy and the like. Yes, Rookwood shrugged. As for a career, one of my uncles works on an international creatures reserve, so I'm applying for an internship there next summer. If it suits me, I might look towards working with dragons or hydras in the future. Those both sound like fascinating branches of study, Pansy remarked. I hope by the beginning of my 4th year I have so clear an idea for my future. Don't worry if nothing strikes a chord your first year, Rookwood said. The basics in every subject are fairly dull. Draco smirked. Tell that to Rigel. He had his future career picked out before he walked onto the Hogwarts Express. Rigel fought a grimace at Draco's blunt phrasing. Perhaps it was a bit too confident to plan your life at 11 years old, but if you wanted something, in Rigel's experience, you had to take it. The world surely wasn't going to hand it to you if you just asked nicely. Oh. Rosier ran his eyes across her features, an amused twist at the edge of his mouth as he spoke. What will you do when you graduate, then? Rigel thought it rather gracious of him to ask what she would do, rather than what she wanted to do, and she answered him honestly, I hope to pursue a potions mastery. The older Slytherins exchanged a surprised look. Rigel wondered if they had been expecting her to say something like a or prank inventor. When they refocused on her, their eyes had grown sharper, more intent, as if they were now engaged in the conversation fully. You have chosen a challenging subject to pursue, Rookwood noted. The potions mastery is rumored to be the most difficult to obtain. Rigel is up to the challenge, Draco said. The sheer confidence he radiated as he spoke made her cheeks grow the tiniest bit warm. A glowing endorsement, Rosier said. Rigel couldn't tell if it was her imagination or if his eyes had really lingered laughingly over her pink-tinged cheekbones when he said glowing. She didn't think he meant to mock her, though, at least not cruelly. The delicate boy simply seemed to have a teasing disposition, and Merlin knew she was familiar enough with those. And remarkably apt, Pansy threw in her support of Rigel as well. Professor Snape has already begun giving Rigel extra tutelage. This caused another fathomless look to pass between Rosier and Rookwood. Professor Snape is good friends with my father, Rosier said slowly, and he does not share his talents lightly. It isn't nearly as exciting as it sounds, Rigel said. At the moment Professor Snape just assigns me a lot of extra work. That sounds like Professor Snape, Rosier laughed. Still, that you have gained his notice at all is quite impressive, Rookwood said, not giving any of his thoughts away with his even voice and still as stone expression, and that you have done so this quickly. Well, you must have nursed this ambition for some time before coming to Hogwarts. Rosier smiled widely. Long-term ambition would certainly go a long way toward explaining your presence here in Slytherin. I wasn't aware that it needed explaining, Rigel said, arching an eyebrow as Draco sometimes did when he was pretending to be obtuse. Rosier's smile never faltered. Weren't you? Many people are curious about you, Mr. Black. They want to know on which side of the wand you will fall. If I do land on one side or the other, rest assured that it will be because I jumped, Rigel said. I like this one. Pansy. Rosier grinned, though he didn't take his eyes off Rigel's expressionless face. Yes, do bring him around more often, Rookwood agreed. The upperclassmen stood, each nodding to Draco and bowing over Pansy's hand gracefully. Until we meet again, Mr. Black. Rosier favored Rigel with a sly wink while Rookwood just nodded politely. "Good day, Mr. Rookwood." Mr. Rosier Rigel nodded respectfully to each of them, then sat slowly back down on the couch once they'd walked away, extremely relieved that the meeting was over. "Oh, that went so well." Pansy beamed at her. "Alden and Edmund have a lot of pull among the upperclassmen. You've made wonderful allies today, Rigel. I understand why you wanted me to meet them, but why did they seem so pleased to meet me?" Rigel asked. "Everyone wants to bring eclat to their own family name, and the best way to do that, short of becoming distinguished through your own merits, is to make good connections. You, Rigel, have talent and ambition, not to mention a respected family name, and so there will never be a shortage of people desiring to connect themselves to you. But everyone in Slytherin is ambitious, right? Surely they'll all want to be the sought after, rather than the seeking." Rigel said, a bit confused. "No reason not to do both." Pansy shrugged. "Then you have twice the clout. Now we only have to hope Alden and Rosie write to their parents about you. If that happens, their mothers will write to my mother and Draco's mother, and we'll be practically ordered to be friends with you." "Oh, good." Rigel smiled tentatively. "Yes, wonderful," Pansy assured her. "Not that we would have dropped you even if the whole house hated you. It's simply not done to treat friends so callously, but this does make life so much easier for us." "Well, as long as that's settled, let's do something productive with the rest of our morning, shall we?" Draco stretched as if he'd been on the couch for hours, rather than 10 minutes or so. "We'll go get our books and meet you at those tables over there in 5 minutes, Pansy. I want to get this history assignment out of the way before lunch." Rigel finished up her own homework assignments with Draco and Pansy, and after lunch she took leave of them to study up on potions and adolescent magical theory, aka work on Flint's homework, in the library. She was using her Ravenclaw disguise today, which involved the brown, twig-like wig and the same pair of common round glasses. In this disguise she walked with extremely poor posture, head down so the coarse strands of hair fell into her face, and shuffled along slowly between the stacks. She thought briefly that if she ever did get discovered and summarily thrown out of Hogwarts, she could at least run away to the Muggle world and take up acting for a living. She had done most of Flint's assignments on Saturday morning, and had been pleased to see that Flint included the old, graded assignments in his letter so that she could be sure she wasn't making the same mistake twice, but she was stuck on an essay about vanishing theory. It was incredibly complicated, and all the passages she read about it seemed to confuse her further. Just when she would start to wrap her head around the idea, a contradictory concept would crop up, and she'd have to change her understanding in order to reconcile it. Rigel stared morosely at the thick book on theoretical transfiguration in front of her. She was sure that transfiguration was one of those subjects that was extremely cumulative, and that jumping 5 years ahead was probably impossible for anyone with less than a genius-level intellect, which she certainly did not possess. Rigel packed the half-completed essay away and replaced the books, deciding that now was the time to take Percy Weasley up on his offer of intellectual enlightenment. Without his help, she didn't think she'd be able to ever finish the essay before it was due on Thursday. She left the library and made her way quickly to the Gryffindor's tower. She had taken to moving quickly through the halls since Friday's incident. She didn't go exploring alone anymore, though she still planned on taking walks with Pansy, but honestly, Pansy knew a lot more defensive magic than she did, and she told herself she wouldn't run errands late at night or early in the morning unless she really needed to. She made it to the fat lady's portrait without incident, and, deciding it would be somewhat rude if she got the password off the map, Rigel knocked several times on the lady's opulent frame. Moments later, a girl with blonde, curly hair and a curious expression cracked the portrait and stuck her head out. She eyed the blue and white tie Rigel had purposely left on after stowing the wig and glasses in her bag and said, "What's up?" in a polite, but not exactly friendly tone. "Is Percy Weasley in there?" she asked. "He told me to ask for him here if I needed help with some books I was reading." At the word books the curious expression left her face and she gave a bored nod. "Yeah, come on in, kid." She pushed open the painting and Rigel climbed carefully through the opening. "Prefect Weasley is over there by those tables." She gestured to a group of study tables that were tucked into a niche between two sets of stairs. Percy sat alone at one of them, up to his shoulders in various books and running ink-stained fingers through his fireball red hair. "He's been in a right state since lunch," the curly-haired girl informed her, "so good luck." Rigel thanked her and headed over to where Percy had barricaded himself into a corner. He seemed to be writing an essay, that or he was just making scratch marks on a sheet of parchment. Percy, she spoke quietly, but he still jumped as if she'd shouted and gaped at her. What? Who? Oh, Rigel, hello, he sighed heavily and rubbed hands against his face, knocking his horn-rimmed glasses askew. How are you? Very well, thank you. She surveyed the books Percy had stacked about him, recognizing a few on sight, working on a potions essay. Yes, he scowled down at the mess of ink and parchment before him. Or I was before potions decided to become ancient Mesopotamian. Drat books don't make any sense. He shook his head briefly, then refocused on her. I'm sorry, did you come for help with something? I need a break from this anyway. Rigel moved a pile of crumpled parchment from a chair and sat, saying, I was hoping you could explain the theory behind vanishing things to me. It was mentioned in a book I was reading about invisibility spells and so I looked it up, but I don't understand parts of it. Oh. Percy looked interested. That's very advanced theory. We're only just now getting into it, in fact. Rigel tried not to fidget guiltily. What are you having trouble with? I don't understand where things go when they are vanished. The book says they go into non-being, but what is that, like another dimension? Rigel asked. Non-being is a kind of theoretical place from which all of being comes out of. It's not really another dimension, since other dimensions are just a different kind of being, but rather it's the opposite of things that are. Vanished objects don't exactly go there, but they become the opposite of being, that is, they become. And once they aren't a being anymore, they are a part of non-being, do you see? Percy raised his eyebrows expectantly. Not really, Rigel frowned. If they don't exist anymore, then how is it possible to get the objects back by unvanishing them? Well, it's all theoretical, Percy began slowly, and you don't really have to understand the physics of it to grasp the theory. Basically just realize that you aren't destroying whatever you vanish. It's not that kind of becoming. More like you're giving it the property of lacking presence in this world. It's still the same as it was before you vanished it, only it doesn't exist here anymore, so it's considered non-being in that sense. The key is in distinguishing between non-being and non-existence. An object in non-being exists, it just doesn't exist in being at the moment. That's why you can retrieve a vanished object, and even a vanished person, if you know how. So, if anything, a vanishment is conditionally temporary. Rigel asked. Yes, that's usually the case, Percy nodded. I'm confused about another thing, Rigel said, and when Percy gestured for her to go on, she continued, I've read that in apparition, for example, where a wizard vanishes and unvanishes himself in two different spatial locations, it's possible for the wizard to splinch himself, without killing himself, which suggests that the connection between vanished parts of an object must survive the vanishment. Do you think it's possible that it might work the same for linked charms? How so? Percy asked, apparently intrigued. I mean, if you vanished an object with a link to something in this world, like say you vanished one of the monitoring orbs the healers use while it was still linked to the person it was monitoring, and then you unvanished it 2 hours later. Would you have data for those 2 hours? Would the orb continue to work as a linked object in non-being, if it remains unchanged in non-being? Well, I don't know why it wouldn't, but you should ask Professor McGonagall in class if you really want to be sure, he said. Would you mind asking her for me? I don't want to come off as showing off by reading ahead. Rigel ducked her head embarrassedly, and Percy chuckled. Well, certainly. I'm quite curious myself. And another thing, Rigel smiled apologetically, but she really wanted to figure this all out before she tried to finish Flint's essay, also to do with apparition. It seems to me that apparition is just the vanishment and unvanishment of a person, but with different spatial dimensions used for the revanishment than were used in the original vanishment. That's one way to look at it, I suppose, Percy acknowledged. Go on. So if we consider that an object's location is the result of its intersection point on the spatial temporal grid, then if it's possible to vanish something across the spatial plane, shouldn't it be possible to also vanish things across the other? Rigel said. You mean time travel? Percy tilted his head amusedly. Yes. Could you vanish an object into the past, for example? I don't know, Rigel. If it were vanishing we were talking about, the answer would be a definite no, but you are correct in saying that vanishings aren't limited to moving through consecutive points. It might be that apparition only works because the wizard is the vanished object, and therefore able to unvanish himself in a different spatial location. I'm not sure if you could send an object across a temporal barrier, because you'd have no control once it was vanished. It's possible to unvanish things usually only to the place they vanished from, though I suppose without any controlling parameters a vanished object could reappear anywhere. He trailed off, thinking hard. And a wizard would have to be impossibly powerful to vanish themselves across that barrier, wouldn't they? Rigel asked. I should think so, Percy said, but I'll ask McGonagall about that too, if you like. Yes, thank you, Rigel said, I'm very interested in figuring all this out. Well, your grasp of it isn't bad so far, Percy said kindly. Thank you. I think I understand it much better now, she said. No problem, he smiled, I actually think I understand it better after helping explain it. And he said ruefully, anything is better than wading through this mess. He gestured to the scattered notes in front of him. Rigel's eyes traced over the table, taking in the mountains of books and splatters of ink. She could have left. She could have walked away right then and Percy wouldn't have begrudged her for a moment. He would never expect recompense for helping her, Gryffindor that he was, but as she sat there, taking in his pained and hopeless expression, she knew that she had to at least try to help him in return. What's the essay on? She asked, her tone casual in case it turned out to be a topic she couldn't actually help him with. Potion fusion, Percy sighed. Professor Snape assigned everyone 2 potions, and we're supposed to imagine we have a friend who needs to take both at the same time and figure out what needs to be changed about the dosages and ingredients in order to make them both compatible and effective. It's a nightmare, and Professor Snape always gives me the trickiest assignments because he thinks I'm an uppity, fact-grasping, know-it-all. Rigel raised her eyebrows at the insult, and Percy flushed sheepishly. That's what he wrote on my last paper. Rigel took another look at the books on the table. Well, the first problem is that you're reading Bonagage, she said. That fool hardly ever gets anything right. Percy looked at her like she'd grown horns. I read potions journals, Rigel said, and the general consensus among the academic community is that Bonagage is a blithering idiot who wouldn't know not grass from fluckweed if he had to wipe his ass with them. If you cite him in your essay, Snape probably won't even read it. Percy blinked several times before resolutely pushing the book in question away from him. Could I, borrow those journals sometime? He asked politely. Sure, but for now, what potions did you get? Rigel scooted her chair closer to peer at the prefect's notes. Skelgrow and blood replenishing potion, Percy said. You, know much about potions, Rigel. Yeah, I like potions, she said easily. What have you worked out so far? Well, the biggest trouble is with the bloodroot from the blood replenishing potion, which reacts badly with the skullcap flowers in Skelgrow, and the huge amount of nettle leaves needed for Skelgrow, which tend to explode when placed in dragon bile. Unfortunately, blood replenishing potion is brewed on a dragon bile base. Percy pursed his lips. Also, the ginger and the cayenne used in Skelgrow to burn infection away are blood thinners and circulators, both of which would be very bad to give to someone who's possibly bleeding, having suffered a wound they'd need to take blood replenishing potion for. This is a tricky one. Rigel tapped her finger against the table unconsciously. What have you tried tweaking? Well, at first I thought I could use willow bark instead of bloodroot for the blood replenisher, but willow bark needs to stew for over an hour, which is too long to leave the vervain in without rendering the whole thing undrinkable. I can't just leave the vervain until last, either, because it has to go in at the same time as the hypericum flowers, which must go in straight after the St. Stuart's bane in order to bond properly to the dissolving stalks. Percy said all this in a wearily defeated kind of a way. Why not use a different painkiller besides willow bark? Rigel asked. Any of the others that I've come across so far have reacted violently with the trillium, which I can't take out of the Skelgrow without causing the drinker's muscles to cramp around the growing bones and make them regrow crookedly, Percy said. What about feverfew? Rigel flipped through one of the herbal indexes on the table, but she couldn't find feverfew listed in it. Is that an anesthetic? Percy frowned. It's not in any of these. Yes, it's a rather hairy flower that grows in Southeast Europe, Rigel said. It'll work as a painkiller if you use enough of it. You need about 3 times as much feverfew as you would bloodroot, but it would go easily with the skullcap flowers, I think. You're sure about this? Percy glanced at her apologetically. You seem very bright, but Professor Snape already hates me. What have you got to lose? Rigel smiled slightly. Incidentally, feverfew also prevents platelets from clumping, so it's really quite perfect for a blood replenishing potion. Percy laughed, but wrote it down nonetheless. All right, Rigel, what else have you got for me? Well, I think you should consider replacing the ginger and cayenne with oat straw, Rigel said. Oat straw? Percy's lips twisted wryly. Something else that's definitely not in any of these indexes. What does that one do? Well, it's a non-inflammatory, which never hurts, and it's rolling in calcium and other vitamins. It will act as a thickening agent, but you can combat that by adding twice as much chimera milk. Seriously, she added as Percy hesitated once more, cows eat oat straw all the time, so you know it's good for bones. I'll be sure to tell Professor Snape that. He shook his head, scribbling away, but what will burn out infections if we take the ginger and cayenne out? We already added feverfew to the blood replenishing potion, Rigel said. Even though the Skelgrow itself won't have anything to ward off infection, if you're giving them to the person at the same time, it won't matter. Percy smiled slowly. That's brilliant. Except for the nettle leaves, Rigel grimaced. I know. They're as important to the Skelgrow potion as the dragon bile is to the blood replenisher. You could maybe mimic the effect by adding about 2 tons of rosemary. But the rosemary would mix with the St. Stuart's bane and make the person vomit both potions back up, so it's useless, Percy said. Yeah, Rigel frowned. Professor Snape really does hate you. Percy snorted. Could be worse. I heard he gave Oliver Wood Amortensia and Wolfsbane. In what situation would you ever have to administer both Amortensia and Wolfsbane at the same time? Rigel wrinkled her nose. It would have to be a werewolf who was drinking it, or the Wolfsbane would just poison them, and you'd have to be insane to want a soon-to-be wolf to fall obsessively in lust with you on the night of the full moon. Percy laughed loudly, causing several people in the main common room to turn and stare at the unusual sight. I'll tell Oliver to write his essay on that. It's not like Snape doesn't already give him hell for being the Gryffindor Quidditch captain. They flipped listlessly through the ingredient indexes, throwing out suggestion after suggestion, until Percy shut his book and laid his glasses down on top of it, massaging his forehead. I just don't see how you can take the nettle leaves out of Skelgrow. It's impossible. Rigel sat up straighter, thinking over what Percy had just said. Maybe you're not supposed to, she said slowly. Maybe you just have to alter the nettles so that they don't react with the dragon bile. But in doing that you would also be stripping the nettles of any regenerative properties they have, which is the entire point of keeping the nettle leaves, Percy said. What if it was like a vanishing spell, but opposite? Rigel said excitedly. What? Percy put his glasses back on to stare confusedly at her. Temporarily conditional. Rigel grinned. It was the perfect solution. Explain, Percy demanded, quill poised over his notes. When a person drinks blood replenishing potions, what happens to the dragon bile? It gets rejected and drained from the stomach almost immediately, so at most you have about 2 minutes that the nettles are dangerous if reactive. We coat the nettle leaves with ephedra oil, right before we put them into the base. Ephedra oil is non-reactive, extremely mild, but it disperses naturally when it bonds with dissolved mullein root. Percy was grinning now, too, so we add whole stalks of mullein root to either of the potions, and when the blood replenishing potion is ingested, the dragon bile will be drained out before the mullein root fully dissolves, and by the time the ephedra oil is gone and the nettles are active again, there's no dragon bile left to react with. It's genius. Rigel smiled as she watched Percy become completely embroiled in his notes, and waited patiently for him to remember her presence. Perfect, it all works out perfectly, he muttered happily to himself. Rigel, oh. Rigel, he turned back to her. I don't know how to thank you, but this is. It was no trouble, Rigel said. I like potions, and you helped me a ton with that transfiguration theory. Still, he said, practically beaming with excitement, I'm gonna show Professor Snape this time, and I couldn't have done it without you. Anytime you need help with anything, day or night, just come find me. Thanks, Percy. Rigel nodded seriously. Oh. Percy, someone called frantically from the portrait hole, you better get down to the 4th floor. Your brothers. Oh, Merlin, what have they done now? Percy stood immediately, glancing distractedly at the cluttered table. I'll look after your stuff for you until you get back, Rigel offered. Will you? Thanks, Rigel. He straightened his robes briskly and headed off toward the portrait hole. One of these days I'm going to owl mum about those two. Rigel pulled out the Transfiguration essay she was writing for Flint and decided to finish it up there, so that she could mail Flint his finished assignments while she was already near the Owlery. She used the barricade of books to hide her awkward usage of her left hand to pin down the parchment as she wrote, and 30 minutes later she had completed the essay on vanishing theory, stowed it in her bag, and had settled into perusing the potions books on the table, a couple of which she hadn't read more than once. She was starting to wonder if Percy had been caught up in some horrible prank gone wrong, when she was pulled from her reading by a familiar voice. "Strange place to do your homework, isn't it?" Rigel looked up in time to see Lee Jordan claim the seat across from her casually. "These are the study tables," Rigel pointed out. "Ah yeah, in the Gryffindor common room," Lee laughed. "You're really something else, kid." Rigel raised her eyebrows. "If you say so." "I'm not the only one." Lee leaned back until his chair was balanced on the back two legs. "The twins talk about you all the time." "Do they?" Rigel said in a bland tone of voice. "Yeah, but that's the Weasley twins for you." Lee shrugged, "always going on about their newest discovery. They get tired of things pretty quickly, though. Well, everything except one another, I guess." "And you, too," Rigel said. "You've been their friend for years, haven't you?" "Yeah, you'd think," Lee said, staring across the common room listlessly. "Sometimes, I don't know. They keep secrets with each other, hide things from me." "Everyone hides things," Rigel said, "don't you?" Lee looked startled, as if he'd never considered that he had things he kept buried as well. His gaze drifted over to the fire. "Still, when it comes down to it, twins only ever look toward each other." Rigel said nothing, not wanting to put more of her opinions into the middle of what was obviously a complex and touchy friendship. It turned out she didn't have to say anything, as Lee stood up just as inexplicably as he'd sat, and said, "Don't let them wear you out," as he walked away. Rigel was left feeling very unsettled, for about 5 seconds. At that point she was set upon by the tricksters themselves. They led the way through the portrait hole like grandstanders, triumphant grins drawing knowing smirks from the other Gryffindors. Percy came stumbling in behind them, looking drawn and exasperated. The eldest Weasley headed straight for the study tables, ignoring his brother's attempts to cajole him into accepting their sincerest apologies. It was then Rigel noticed that Percy's prefect badge was spitting confetti with every third step he took. "Honestly," Pierce Fred was saying when they came within earshot, "that spell was meant to hit Cynthia Bradford, the Slytherin prefect, not you. And that makes it better." Percy scowled. "You can't just go around pranking prefects for no reason." "How does it look?" "My own brothers, the biggest source of insubordinate machinations." Whoa, Percy, who said we did it for no reason?" George said from Percy's other side. "It's not our fault we're involved in the, Rigel." George looked pleasantly bemused to see her sitting at a study table in their common room. "Puppy!" Fred cried cheerfully, bounding over to snag a seat next to her at the table. George wasted no time in claiming the seat on her right side, leaving Percy to sit across from them. Instead, Percy just sighed and began packing up his notes and books. "May as well finish this in my dorm room for all the work I'll get done with these two around. See you, Rigel, and thanks again." "The gratitude is all mine," Percy Rigel said, "until we meet again." With a short nod, Percy trudged off to the fifth-year boys' staircase. "So what could a first-year Slytherin possibly be helping our brother the perfect prefect with?" George asked curiously. "And don't you dare lie to us, for Fred and I always know," Fred said. "Percy and I have a mutual understanding," Rigel said loftily, "and since we are newly discovered allies, I feel it my duty to ask if you really did make his prefect badge belch confetti on purpose, because that was quite an ingenious spell." Fred and George laughed, both shaking their heads in cinch. "A happy accident," Fred said proudly. "The target, not the spell," George clarified. "Why were you pranking Slytherins?" Rigel put on a sad expression. "Am I not entertainment enough for you?" "Perish the thought." Fred put a hand to his mouth in abject horror. "We were performing an odious duty, and nothing more. Haven't you heard?" George smiled enigmatically at her. "Slytherin and Gryffindor are involved in a prank war, so our services have been enlisted. It started Friday night. Any guesses why?" Rigel frowned. "Surely not. Regular martyr, aren't you?" Fred teased. "We heard you were viciously set upon by a cowardly Gryffindor while innocently walking through the dungeons past curfew on Friday night." The Slytherins are apparently so up in arms, or whatever the snaky equivalent of arms is, about it that they've sworn revenge against any and all Gryffindors who cross their path. Hence, the prank war, George said, shaking his head with amusement, as if they needed to come up with such an elaborate ex. We don't know for certain it was a Gryffindor. Cus. Are you saying you really were attacked? Fred frowned and sent a troubled look at George, whose face was suddenly very blank. We thought they just wanted a reason to have a go at us, and made up a sympathetic story about a first year being attacked unprovoked from behind to keep the claws and puffs from ganging up on them. Oh, well. Rigel shrugged, it really might not have been a Gryffindor. But you were attacked. Again George's eyes were icy and flat. I guess, Rigel said slowly, yeah, it was pretty clearly an attack this time. I kind of wish I knew who was doing this. You kind of wish you knew. George repeated, Rigel, you need to take this more seriously. How many times have you been targeted, be honest? Rigel tallied them up in her head. There was the first incident, where she broke her wrist, the one where she got trapped in a trickster and dung-bombed, and then the stinging hex. 3, I think. You think? Fred prompted. Well, I sort of thought someone was following me between classes one day, but they didn't shoot a spell at me, she said, wondering if the blonde butterfly Zabin I was talking about could be her attacker. Merlin, Rigel. George took a deep breath, then let it out slowly, okay. First of all, you have a stalker. And second of all, Fred said, equally serious, we're walking you back to your common room tonight. Tonight. Rigel craned her neck to try and see outside of the alcove, which had no windows. What time is it? Fred and George both cracked amused smiles, and Rigel felt like all must be okay in the world as long as the Weasley twins could still smile. It was much more reassuring than 100 concerned glances could ever be. It's nearly 7:30, George told her. How long did Percy chain you to these desks? Leaving the chains thing alone for now, it was long enough to drive my friends mad with worry, she sighed. I can't believe I missed dinner again. No problem, Fred grinned, we'll stop by the kitchens on the way down. Can we stop by the owlery, too, she said, I have some letters I'd rather mail while I'm already in this part of the castle. Better you go with us, anyway, considering how steep the owlery stairs are, George said, but first we want to check on your wrist. Rigel offered up her left arm for their inspection. It was strange to be letting people handle it after a long week of training herself to keep it out of sight. Fred unwrapped it carefully while George checked the range of motion and feeling in her fingers. It looks like it hasn't healed much, Fred shook his head regretfully, so either something is preventing your body from fixing itself or the injury's been treated so roughly in the past week that your body can barely keep it from worsening. They stared at her expectantly. She fidgeted. Oh, puppy, what did you do? Fred tsked reprovingly. Rigel rolled her eyes, it wasn't my fault. She explained about getting stuck in the trap stair. The twins had never heard of a trickster on that particular stairway either, then about the G-forces from flying lessons and helping Draco practice, then getting hexed into a wall after hours of jostling it in detention. And that's not to mention that crazy Hufflepuff girl body checking me into the railing on the owlery steps, Rigel scowled. What Hufflepuff? George asked. Abbott, something Abbott, Rigel said, she ran smack into me when I was heading up to mail a letter. My wrist felt as horrible after that as it did when I first broke it. She didn't see you on the stairs? Fred asked carefully, his eyes focused on her wrist, but his lips pursed suspiciously. She said she wasn't looking. I wasn't either, because of the wind. She just came barreling out of the roost. Rigel shuddered, girls are heavier than they look. That's sort of strange, isn't it? George glanced at Fred, that you ran into her right before you were attacked coming back from the owlery. I guess it was a weird coincidence. Rigel blinked suddenly. You know, she is blonde. Blonde. Fred chuckled. I know it's not as attractive as red hair, but being blonde isn't actually a crime. Zabin, I said the person, well, he said butterfly, but I'm pretty sure it was a person, who was following me on Thursday was blonde. Well, blonde or brunette, you need to be more careful with that wrist. George cast a numbing spell and Rigel sighed involuntarily as pain that hadn't even been registering faded away abruptly. It surprised a smile out of her, and Fred and George exchanged another one of their looks. Come to think of it, a lot of people send silent messages with their eyes while I'm around. Draco and Pansy, Fred and George, though they probably do that anyway. Rookwood and Rosier, again, probably not me, and even Neville and Ron have done it a few times. When the pain gets bad like that, find one of us to recast it for you. Yes, Dr. George. Rigel quirked her lips wryly. You mean Dr. Fred? Fred corrected as he conjured her a new bandage. I'm Dr. George. Whatever you say, Fred. Rigel gathered her book bag and stood. This one's clever, Forge. Fred sighed. Didn't you see the tie, Gred? George tugged playfully on Rigel's blue and white necktie. Oh, very nice. Fred eyed it appreciatively. You can't even tell it's a charm. I was wondering how you'd managed to stay in one piece by yourself so long in the nest. I must say, it's not quite as impressive once you know the trick. Hear that, George? Rigel said, you've shattered the illusion. I'll buy him a new one when I'm rich and famous. George smiled easily. They headed off to the owlery, Fred and George taking their role as bodyguards a bit too far and scaring the wits out of Lee Jordan as he came around the corner toward the fat lady's painting. He declined their invitation to join them cheerfully, saying he was headed to a game of Exploding Snap with Angelina Johnson, and after that the twins refrained from shooting firecrackers at anyone they came across unexpectedly. When they reached the base of the West Tower, Rigel stopped. Would you two mind waiting for me down here? She asked, hoping she didn't offend them. How can we stop the heartless miscreants from toppling you down the icy? They probably won't be icy in mid-September. And treacherous stairs, if we aren't on the stairs with you. Fred raised his eyebrows as if to say obviously. How about we wait at the top of the stairs, and just cover our ears while you reveal the secrets of the universe to your owl? George offered, you can even blindfold us, if you like. It's not that I don't trust you guys, she started, but Fred cut her off good-naturedly. It's fine. Everybody has secrets, Rigel. She smiled, recalling her words to Lee not an hour before. I guess everyone here really does have secrets. And there was me thinking non-disclosure was such a crime. She thought about Flint, and his apparently sick mother, then she thought about Binny the house elf, and the sort of secrets she kept so gladly. Probably even the teachers had secrets. Even the ghosts. And it seems like most people are okay with that, here. How interesting, that muggles often feel so entitled to know the truth about everything, while wizards accept that there can be true meaning expressed in spite of secrets kept. Perhaps wizards are used to looking into the great mysteries of the world and not asking any questions. Or maybe, Rigel thought wryly, we've been naturally selecting for sneakiness, hiding from the muggles all these years. Personally, I wouldn't trust Gred either, George stage whispered, but I'll keep a close watch on this rascal. Me. Fred clutched Rigel's right elbow and batted his tawny eyelashes up at her. He'd bent nearly double to achieve that effect. Don't believe these slanderous lies, Rigel, he's the one you have to watch out for, ask anyone. They'll all tell you Fred's the evil twin. George shot Rigel a glance that was brimming with exasperated fondness, as if to say, isn't he wonderful, in a rather strange way. Rigel grinned back, and Fred frowned as he caught on. Oh, you already guessed I was Fred today, didn't you? I'm afraid so, Rigel said. They reached the top of the stairs and Rigel hurried inside while George and Fred took up positions on either side of the doorway like sentinels. She caught the eyes of a few owls while she pulled her missives from her bag and grouped them. She speed-rolled the new essays for Flint, she was keeping the old essays for reference, and also the letters to Remus, Sirius, and Archie, which contained highly edited accounts of the last couple weeks. As she was handing the letters to her uncles off to the first owl, she was sending Remus with Sirius because sometimes Remus traveled unexpectedly for his work. Fred began a particularly spirited rendition of A Cauldron Full of Hot, Strong Love. George joined in counterpart just as exuberantly, and Rigel realized they were trying to advertise just how much they weren't listening. She sent the letters off, whispering to the owl that went to Flint, just in case, and jogged back over to the stairs. I'll boil you up some, oomph. Fred was elbowed in the stomach by George when he caught sight of her. Oh, that was fast. Didn't want to leave you guys standing out here too long, she said, then stopped and leaned slightly away from them as the redheads broke into identical, and honestly quite alarming, self-satisfied smiles. What? I hear the cold air isn't good for people of a delicate or disagreeable humor. It's too late to insult us now. George linked his arm through her elbow carefully, avoiding her wrist. Fred took up her other side. We've already figured out you like us. Rigel resigned herself to a life of friends and acquaintances. At the rate she was earning new ones, she'd never be able to get rid of them all. Fred and George hung back as they reached the entrance hall, and Rigel got the distinct feeling that she was about to be tested. She ignored her escort's growing smirks of glee as she turned down the basement corridor without prompt, but when she blithely turned abruptly toward a set of stairs that led to the dungeons, and away from the kitchens, Fred groaned dejectedly and Rigel couldn't suppress her sly smile anymore. "What's this?" George took a finger and tapped Rigel's nose with it. "Fred, our puppy is having us on. So you do know where the kitchens are?" Fred perked up. "Good one." They laughed, and turned back until they reached the still life painting of fruit, where Fred insisted she do the honors and tickle the pear. They were barely through the door when they were assaulted by house elves. Well, Fred and George were, at least. They were apparently extremely popular with the Hogwarts helpers, and they mingled happily among the little elves, greeting many by name, bouncing some on their shoulders, and swinging others up on 2 tables so they could see them better. The elves laughed delightedly in their squeaky little voices and steadily presented Fred and George with offerings of food, which the brothers accepted politely and stuffed into a bottomless bag they seemed to have brought with them for exactly this purpose. Rigel found a seat at one of the long tables and just watched the vibrant Gryffindors play like primary school kids among elves at least thrice their age. After a few minutes, an elf she recognized plopped a huge bowl of strawberries down in front of her. "You is liking these?" Binny smiled hugely at her as she plopped her tiny form on the bench next to Rigel. "Binny." Rigel reached over to hug the blushing elf. "Thank you, I do love strawberries. And thanks for the help with the you-know-what the other day." "Do we know?" "I don't believe we do." Rigel cringed as Fred and George appeared over her shoulder without warning. "Making deals with house elves, little snake." George sighed despairingly. "I hope you got it in writing, because I have it on good information that Binny here is notoriously difficult to pin down when the blood starts flying." "Mr. Weasley shouldn't be saying such things." Binny wagged her finger crossly, but even Rigel could tell that this was an old joke between them. "That's right, Forge, we were sworn to silence, remember? You don't want to go the same way as the other guy, do you?" Fred shook his head mournfully. "What other guy?" George asked. "The one that disappeared the same week the elves started serving lumpy gravy." "You," Rigel said, chuckling at the look of exaggerated innocence Binny was now portraying. "Binny doesn't know what you is talking about," the elf said solemnly. "Binny is never ever serving gravy with suspicious lumps in it. Such a thing is being vicious slander." Fred and George collapsed onto the tabletop with laughter, and Binny gave a dainty curtsy as she hopped off the bench. "Is you wanting anything else?" "We actually came here because Rigel missed dinner," George said, wiping at his eyes as he collected himself. Several house elves in the immediate vicinity gasped with dismay and ran to get food for her as fast as their legs could carry them. Rigel watched with wide eyes as plates and plates of vegetables, fishes, fruits, nuts, breads, cheeses, and a pitcher of apple juice were piled in front of her. She thanked them and dug in ravenously. "You a vegetarian, puppy?" Fred glanced over the selection bemusedly. "Yeah, though I don't know how they knew." "The house elves know everything, devilishly clever, they are," George said. "At least this helps explain why you're so tiny." "But you have to eat more protein," Fred said, grabbing a few hard-boiled eggs and putting them onto her plate, "or you'll heal even slower." Rigel shrugged agreeably, still eating. When she was finished they bade goodbye to the friendly elves, and Rigel promised to visit Binny again soon. Fred and George walked her as far as the potions classroom, but there they had to stop. They already knew where the Slytherin common room was, of course, but they didn't think her housemates would take kindly to them coming within a 20-foot radius of it, particularly in the middle of a prank war. They were reluctant to let her walk alone even through the dungeons, though, and it showed on their faces as they said goodnight. "I'm in snake territory now," she reminded them, "perfectly safe." "You were attacked in the dungeons 2 nights ago," George rolled his eyes. "And I got away, because I had home turf advantage," she said. "Seriously, I'm a wicked fast runner." "You shouldn't have to run from anything," Fred said softly, "not at Hogwarts. You'd be surprised how much there is to run from at Hogwarts. The past. The truth. Hey." The 3 of them turned to see Adrian Pusey and a guy she only knew on sight as Lucian Bowl, beater for the Slytherin house team, striding toward them aggressively. Pusey was the one who had called out. "What's a pair of griffins doing so far from their tower?" Bo, who had long black hair and a superior expression, sneered. George rolled his eyes and Fred yawned dramatically. "These guys bothering you, Black?" Pusey looked her over swiftly and relaxed slightly when she appeared to be in good health. Her left hand was completely hidden from view by George. No, they were helping me, actually," Rigel said quickly. "They heard about the attack on Friday and wanted to make sure I got back to the common room safely." "You were going to lead them straight to our common room?" "You stupid." "Luck, they already know where it is," Pusey said reasonably. "And they were just leaving me here." In any case, Rigel smiled oh so sweetly at Bo. Bo hummed disagreeably, "You must have some nerve showing your face down here if you heard about the attack." "Well," now George lifted his hands in a helpless gesture that no one there bought for a moment, "it's not yet certain that it's a Gryffindor that wants to hurt our little snake. But if it turns out that it is," Fred grinned in a rather frightening facsimile of Snape, "we'll be the first to defect to the Slytherin camp. And perhaps we'll start a little campaign of our own on the side. Personalization is the key to a good hell, I always say." "Night, Rigel," they chorused, winking slyly at her and waving sarcastically to the other two Slytherins as they made their way unerringly toward the closest set of stairs. Pusey raised his eyebrows at their departure. "Well, that's good to know, at least. You have interesting taste in allies, Black." "I don't trust those tricksters," Bull said. Rigel noticed he looked a lot less scary than he had a few minutes earlier, and wondered how much of the other house's opinions of Slytherin could be attributed to the Slytherins' acting abilities, but if they're as good as their word, they might be useful. Rigel looked up at the two of them questioningly, wondering if she should go on ahead or. "We'll take you from here," Pusey said, and Bull nodded. It wasn't until they walked into the common room and Rigel realized she'd been out after curfew again, and this time she'd walked in with two upperclassmen practically playing bodyguards, that Rigel thought she really ought to stop attracting so much attention. She really was receiving more scrutiny than she'd planned on. Then again, probably it was always like this the first few weeks back, with everyone wanting to figure out the new kids and still restless from the summer. Probably things would settle down very soon. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13. Part 1, No POV. Every September, on the third Friday of the new semester, Albus Dumbledore met with his heads of house to assess the progress of the term. They assembled in the staff lounge, instead of in the official meeting room, and took it in turn to bring up anything that might be of pertinence to the others, all very informally and off the record. It was not, as Professor Sinistra so often claimed, an excuse for the closest-knit members of the staff, who just so happened to be Filius, Pomona, Minerva, Severus, and Albus, to gossip shamelessly about the school and everything in it, but rather it was a chance to address the more delicate matters that really should be kept within the heads of house. Really? Well, Albus twinkled fondly at them all, his very own collection, nay, family, of some of the greatest minds in the modern magical community. The headmaster was sitting on a rocking chair by the fire, his hands twiddling idly as he spoke. "Here we are again. Some of us more willingly than others," Filius chortled, glancing from his seat on a plushy velvet footstool at Severus, who favored them all with a sardonic twist of his thin lips as he sipped a very black cup of tea and sat in a very black leather armchair across from Albus. Pomona, who was sitting next to Minerva on the couch, patted her co-worker's arm conspiratorially. "He does that so well, doesn't he?" Minerva pursed her lips to hide her smile of agreement. She and Severus had a friendship that only worked because neither of them admitted to it, a little too well. "How many of my cubs have you traumatized this month, Severus?" "No more than deserved it," Minerva. Severus smirked, as always. "Now, Severus." Albus paused in his rocking for a moment to summon one of the warm, knitted blankets Hagrid was always making and then leaving in the cupboard. "We know how much you value a controlled work environment. Potions is an exceedingly dangerous and in the presence of adolescents unpredictable art. And none of us would ever dream of telling you how to run your classroom. I highly doubt that any of you soft-hearted mollycoddlers would have the stomach to prevent the number of near maimings I deal with every day. But was it really necessary to tell your class of third-year Ravenclaws that you would personally make sure they failed their owls in 2 years if they didn't produce a satisfactory weakening solution by the end of the period?" Albus gazed mildly at the ceiling. "I'm told Madame Pomfrey ran completely out of calming drafts that afternoon, as you had apparently sent several Hufflepuffs into hysterics earlier that morning by insinuating that you would test their antidotes by poisoning them all. As I am the one who provides Poppy with those calming drafts, and therefore the one who will have to replace them all, I see no reason for anyone else to complain. Severus refilled his teacup unconcernedly. Besides, every single one of those brats produced satisfactory results, so at the very least my methods are effective. Leaving the subject of Severus' notorious teaching habits for the moment, Pomona put in, there were a couple of students I thought we should discuss. Yes, I would say the same, Minerva said tersely. Who are you concerned about? Well, first, I wondered what you all thought of Neville Longbottom, she said. He seems to be quite bright. Severus snorted incredulously, but extremely timid, at least before he became friends with Ronald Weasley. His behavior is a bit unusual, Phileas said, considering how lively both his parents were here at school. Do we have any reason to believe his home life is unpleasant? Frank and Alice abuse a child. Minerva huffed. Never. The grandmother, though. Phileas grimaced apologetically at Albus. Our Albus nodded sagely. As much as I admire Augusta, she always was a bit overbearing, especially when it came to children. I believe she lives with her son now to help in raising her grandchild, so it very well may be the case that she has induced a low sense of self-confidence in the child. Keep an eye on the boy, Minerva, and see that he makes a few friends. On the subject of students with troubled home lives, Pomona said tentatively, I also noticed something off about Marcus Flint. After being forced to repeat his 5th year and denied his IELTS, I expected more resistance, if anything, but has anyone else noticed that his work so far this year is, well, good? It's always on time, and always done to specification. I assigned a diagram the first week, and it was so flawless that I would consider it a tracing, but I've no idea how he could have traced it through such thick parchment. She shook her head bewilderedly. Yes, I was going to mention Mr. Flint as well, Minerva said. He has completed every essay I assigned, and yet, it doesn't sound like him. His tests and quizzes were always slightly sarcastic, as if he were bored and annoyed by the very idea that he be asked to prove what he knows. She set her mouth thinly. Now, though, his quizzes are neutral, and his essays are factual, but peppered with conjecture and suggestions about the theory, which usually betrays a sense of curiosity and captivation with the material. I cannot tell if he has found a new, more subtle way to mock the assignment or if he finds it amusing to completely subvert our expectations of him. Severus put his cup down on his saucer with a pointed click and said, Flint is not doing his assignments this year any more than he did last year. The handwriting charms are convincing, but he has arranged somehow for someone else to complete them. I've no doubt he has changed the tone of his in-class assignments to match the essays and create less suspicion. I have been monitoring the situation from the second week of school, when he began turning assignments into me. I suspect he knows that I am aware of his duplicity, but he also knows that without proof, that is, without knowledge of the person doing the assignments, we cannot do anything about it. The fact is, as long as he doesn't cheat on any tests, which he has no need of doing, it will be impossible to prove that he isn't doing the assignments. What have you uncovered so far, Severus? Albus leaned forward as if he were going to listen very carefully, but then he leaned back again and his incessant rocking continued. His home life is less than ideal, as you know, and so it used to be unusual for Flint to receive mail. Lately, however, he receives suspiciously thick letters from what I imagine are regular school owls, as they are never the same. It is my belief that he is receiving the work from another student, and not the help of someone outside of the castle, though I do not know whom. I have not seen a marked similarity to any of the other 5th year's work as of yet, so I am reasonably confident the accomplice is not in Flint's year, Severus explained. We will have to watch the upper years for signs of inexplicable stress or fatigue, Minerva frowned. If this is true, someone at this school is carrying a doubled workload, which would be nearly impossible for a new student to sustain for long. Could it be a younger student? Phileas asked thoughtfully. Now that I consider it, there is a tone akin to naive fascination about Flint's essays this term, which would fit with a child who hadn't already covered the topic in a previous year. I doubt it is anyone younger than a 4th year, Minerva said. Much can be gotten from books, but Flint turned in a very complicated essay on vanishment theory recently, which showed a firm grasp on both non-being and the logical consequences of an object retaining properties after vanishment. No 3rd year at this school could have understood so much on their own. Since nothing is proven yet, Continue to treat Mr. Flint's work as you would any others, Albus said. In the meantime, Severus, I trust you to keep an eye on the situation. I keep both eyes on my Slytherins without your prompting, I assure you, Severus said shortly. Then I hope you will be having a word with young Mr. Black, as well, Minerva sniffed, turning her head to pin Severus with a stern look. I don't know what to do with the boy. He is becoming exceedingly difficult to teach. Severus' eyebrows furrowed. I'm sure I don't know what you are implying, Minerva. The boy is polite and hard-working. His written assignments are well thought out, and his practical work is nearly flawless. And don't you twinkle at me like that, Albus. The past does not cloud my eyes so much that I cannot see when potential lies undisguised before me. Well, it sounds as though we are acquainted with two very different Mr. Blacks, Minerva said. I admit his written work is generally good, and in fact his impeccable comprehension of the theory behind the material is the only thing keeping him at a passing level. His practical work is non-existent. I have yet to see him perform a single piece of transfiguration, though I have evidence that he succeeded rather quickly in the very first lesson. Severus frowned, as did Pomona. I've not had any trouble, she said. Mr. Black is a veritable fountain of knowledge when it comes to plants, particularly the ones useful in potions. She nodded in acknowledgement to Severus, and he certainly isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, though he's so ambidextrous it's like he forgets he has another hand at times. She chuckled, but the other heads of house look seriously at one another. It's quite a discrepancy, Phileas piped up. I have to agree with Minerva, however. I try to give him as much credit for his written work, which is supreme, but although he knows the incantation and the wand movement, he never actually does the spell in front of me. He refuses to. Albus asked mildly. No, Minerva tapped her foot agitatedly. He seems to try very hard, numerous times, but it's as if, well. Mr. Black cannot be a squib, Severus snapped. I have watched him brew, and he has no trouble unconsciously imbuing his potions with magic. Indeed, he puts a bit too much in at times, which I believe is due to his enthusiasm for the subject. Roland R. tells me that on the day Mr. Longbottom fell from his broom, his motion was inexplicably arrested before he hit the ground. Roland R. believed it to be an incident of accidental magic, but she says that Mr. Malfoy claimed it to have been Mr. Black who stopped Mr. Longbottom's fall, Pomona told them. Phileas raised his eyebrows. I wondered why, on his first homework assignment, Mr. Black wrote that he could not use the Wingardium Leviosa charm to levitate any of the listed objects, except a human being, he sighed, but as far as I know he has never even made his feather twitch. It seems we have a puzzle on our hands, Albus said as his staff looked around at one another. He was rocking more slowly now, carefully braiding sections of his beard. A young wizard has all the necessary understanding, diligence, and potential to perform magic, and yet, he doesn't. His ability reveals itself in spontaneous or unconscious ways, but he cannot seem to channel it on command. He is neither so traumatized nor so introspective as to have formed a natural block on his magic. Indeed, he is purportedly highly social, with friends not only in his own house, but in Gryffindor, too. So, any ideas? Severus. He is in your house, after all. Severus scowled. I had not realized there was a problem until now, though certain things, like how he always asked Mr. Malfoy to light his cauldron or Miss Parkinson to perform the protection charm on his eyes even after asking me for the proper spell, make sense in hindsight. I know that his interest is primarily in potions at this time, but I had not thought he would go so far as to dismiss the other subjects completely. It isn't that, really, Phileas said fairly. Mr. Black does try, and his friends encourage him as well. I have even overheard him say that he goes to the library on weekends for extra study. He isn't using a hand-me-down wand or some such, is he? Not to my knowledge, Severus said, still visibly irritated that such a thing had escaped his notice, but I will schedule a conference with him this week, after I collect progress reports from all of his professors. This will not be allowed to continue. Keep us abreast of your decisions, won't you, Severus? Albus smiled when the potions master nodded briskly. Very well, what else? The prefects have presented me with a petition for increasing the number of Hogsmeade weekends around the holidays. Part 2, Rigel's POV, and small time skip. The last week in September came too slowly for Rigel's peace of mind. Her wrist was feeling slightly better, and finally beginning the slow, torturous healing process, which would be complete by Halloween, the twins estimated. She was quite busy, keeping up with both her own and Flint's assignments, not to mention the punishments her teachers heaped on her for her poor spell work, and she didn't see her friends as much as she would have liked, but part of this was due to Draco's own schedule, which was as arduous at least as Rigel's. "We have practice every other evening," Draco bemoaned Thursday morning after he drifted off at the breakfast table and Pansy nudged him awake sharply. "It's like Flint doesn't have anything better to do than play Quidditch, never mind that us mere humans can barely keep up with our classes on top of his schedule." "Doesn't the captain care about his own grades?" Pansy asked, puzzled, before biting into a muffin daintily. "That's the weird part, his grades are fine. Better than fine, according to some of the upper years on the team," Draco said. "I heard them say he must have a time turner or something, since the other fifth years have started skiving off some of their assignments to make all the practices." Rigel tried not to look guilty, though she supposed it wasn't really her fault that Flint had so much free time. After all, he hadn't done the assignments last year, either, but then he had to serve so many detentions for not doing his work that he couldn't schedule so many practices. This year though. "Well, at least you'll be a shoo-in for the cup," Rigel said. "None of the other teams are practicing so hard, are they?" "I think Wood tried to enact a similar schedule, but apparently his beaters and chasers revolted," Draco sighed, as if thinking wistfully about inciting a revolution of his own. "Maybe when you win the first match he'll back off some," Pansy said. "Until then, hurry up and eat so we can look over our transfiguration assignments before potions." The three of them were packing up after a particularly interesting potions lecture on the classification of dark and light ingredients when Professor Snape said, "Mr. Black, see me in my office after afternoon classes." "Yes, Sir," Rigel said automatically, finding no clue as to the potion master's intentions in his customary scowl. She hoisted her bag over her right shoulder and hurried to catch up with Draco and Pansy, who were waiting patiently at the door. "What do you think he wants?" Pansy asked. "You didn't get caught doing anything, did you?" "Nothing I know of," Rigel shrugged. "Maybe he has another assignment for me." "He just gave you that essay on ingredients taken from magical beings," Draco pointed out as they climbed the stairs toward the Great Hall, "and he doesn't need you to come to his office to give you an assignment. If you're meeting after classes, it means whatever it is will take some time." "I'll find out this afternoon, I guess," Rigel said. Pansy looked as if she would nibble on her lip until she realized they had entered the Great Hall and smoothed her face into a poised mask. "Let us know, then, won't you?" "Of course." If Rigel thought a summoning to Snape's office would be less nerve-wracking the second time, she quickly re-evaluated this misconception as she stood before the solidly imposing door, steeling herself to grasp the silver handle and turn it. A voice called impatiently from within before she got the chance, and she sheepishly entered the gloomy space and saw, to her surprise, that Professor Snape had provided her with a chair this time. She sat, quietly surprised at how comfortable the chair actually was, and glanced unsurely at the dark man sitting across the desk from her. "I'm sure you are wondering why I have called you here, so I will not waste your time with pleasantries," Snape began, folding his hands before him precisely. Rigel nodded her agreement, though it hadn't been asked for. Snape considered her for a long moment, inhaling slowly and fixing a weighty stare in her direction. She tried not to fidget, but was glad when he seemed to come to a decision and began speaking again. "Mr. Black, it is my duty as a professor at this school and particularly as a head of house to pay close attention to the students in my care, and when there appear to be discrepancies in a certain student's work, it does not fail to come to my notice," he said. His voice was just loud enough to fill the small room without echoing, but it could not be called soft. It was deadly. Rigel felt her face blanch and tore her eyes from Snape's to conduct a detailed study of her knees. Her mind flew back to the last batch of corrected essays she'd received from Flint. In it had been the essay on fusing potions that she'd completed for Flint, from the same week she'd helped Percy with his, and written on the top of that essay in red ink where the letter grade should have been, were the words, "Well done, Mr. Flint, but not quite well enough. Make no mistake, the source of your newfound interest in schoolwork will soon be exposed." At the time, she'd written it off as untenable suspicion on Snape's part. After all, how could he ever suspect her? She'd taken extra care with the potions essays to make them sound as unlike hers as she could. In Flint's essays, she used certain words and phrases repeatedly, and then took pains to make sure she never used those identifiers in her own papers. But what if she hadn't been careful enough? What if he knew? I see you have some idea of what I mean, he drawled, and Rigel realized with a start that looking down ashamedly was as good as admitting her guilt. She raised her eyes slowly, widening them to a believable level of innocence as she did, until they rested steadily and blankly at the level of Snape's forehead. He was still speaking, but now a faint frown creased his brow as well. I assure you, I am not the only professor who is displeased with this incongruities, Mr. Black. Your transfiguration, charms, flying, and defense professors have all brought their concerns to me as well, since I am your head of house, and as such it falls to me to deal with this situation. Rigel willed herself fiercely not to allow her face to crumple even slightly, but her eyes became bright with suppressed despair. How could she have messed up so badly that so many professors had connected her to Flint's essays? She had been so careful, it just didn't make sense. Wait. It didn't make sense. Flint didn't take flying, it was a first-year class. Why would Madame Hooch have any relevant concerns? Unless she had mentioned that Flint had unusual amounts of free time to schedule practices, which seemed a bit unlikely, it would certainly be unusual for Snape to include Hooch in the list of professors who noticed something strange about the essays. Unless it wasn't about the essays. Rigel cleared her mind of panic and tried to focus instead on what the professor was saying. I dare say I have never had a student with problems of this exact nature before, he said, making Rigel blink confusedly. Now she knew he couldn't be talking about Flint. After all, students probably copied essays all the time, but she had not the slightest idea of what he was talking about. Usually when a student does poorly in one area, he performs poorly in other areas as well, or else his ineptitude is limited to one class in particular. You, Mr. Black, appear to be doing both remarkably well and impossibly abysmal in several of your classes, while at the same time showing talent across the board in other classes. Perhaps you can explain this phenomena to me. Oh, Rigel thought, right. My interest is primarily in potions, she prevaricated weakly. She really should have known that this would come up soon, but she'd been focused on so many other things that she was left without a plan for dealing with this sort of attention. That does not give you leave to disregard everything else, foolish child, Snape snapped. Rigel shrank back, not understanding why it mattered so much that he would become so vehement about it. I really haven't been, Rigel said, adding, Sir, hastily as Snape's nostrils flared, I do all of my assignments and even study for the quizzes with Pansy and Draco. And your practical performance on these quizzes, he pressed. What can you say about that? Rigel dropped her eyes once more. I try. Snape sighed heavily. You must understand that this cannot continue the way it has been. She peeked up through her lashes at him, as if to say why not. There are many kinds of magic that do not require the use of a wand to master, he said carefully, though his white knuckles from where his fingers clenched one another belied his calm tone of voice, but no wizard can afford to ignore one part of his power entirely. It is folly, not in the least, because it is vital for the development of your magical core that you exercise your magic consciously at this age. In addition to that, it is an embarrassment of a wizard who cannot manage basic spellwork. I will not have an embarrassment accredited to the House of Slytherin, do you understand? Yes, Sir. Rigel swallowed heavily. What did he expect her to do? Didn't he think if she could do the spells, then she would have? Certainly she wasn't earning detentions left and right from McGonagall and Quirrell, the later of whom seemed to delight in assigning her particularly disgusting work with Filch, and barely passing half her classes for kicks. She looked across the desk at the potions master with defeat in her eyes. Something in her expression must have spurred a reaction, for he pinched the bridge of his nose carefully and said, You truly are unable to perform these spells for some reason. And you suffered no magical accidents when you were younger. You are not taking any significant medicinals. Very well, he stretched one hand out toward her briskly. She stared for a moment, still caught in the rhythm of shaking her head yes or no. Let me see your wand, Black, he said, and she ducked down to rummage in her bag for it immediately, eventually handing it over when she found it stuck between two books near the bottom. He looked as if he would comment on her treatment of it, but held his tongue. He inspected it gently, his long fingers probing it for abnormalities or fissures. Ash. Yes. 12 inches, unicorn hair, Rigel said. And you received it at Ollivander's? Snape verified. She nodded. What magic did it manifest? She gazed blankly at him. I mean, what happened when you first held it? Oh, Rigel thought about it. It got sort of warm, I think. Snape stared. That's it, he raised an eyebrow. No sparks. And Ollivander let you buy it? He didn't have many left to offer me at that point, Rigel shrugged. I went through most of his stock, trying to find one that didn't make things explode violently when I touched it, and this one didn't make anything explode, so I kept it. I guess he wasn't too happy, thinking back, but he said it's very well balanced. In truth, he'd said a bit more than that, something about apathetic customers sabotaging the wand matching system, but she hadn't paid much attention, having been ready at that point to leave the creepy shop and pick up a new ingredient at the apothecary. Well balanced it may be, but from the sound of it this wand doesn't suit you very well, Snape said, sounding exasperated at the world in general, and perhaps Rigel in particular. It was the best fit I found, Rigel said, a bit defensively. Better this than a wand that just explodes everything randomly. Be that as it may, settling for an inferior match in a wand can be very dangerous. I suppose Ollivander only allowed it this time because this particular wand is so non-reactive it probably wouldn't cause any destructive problems. Unfortunately, not being a danger to your health is not the usual standard for wands, he glowered fiercely, and if you cannot do magic with it, it might as well be a stick you found on the ground outside. It might not be the wand, though, she said, hesitantly giving voice to a secret fear. Maybe I just can't do wand magic. Maybe I was meant to do potions, and nothing else. Snape snorted, setting her wand back on the desk with ill grace. Mr. Black, there is no difference between the magic which imbues potions and the magic that turns a teacup into a rabbit besides the manner in which it is channeled. All magic is at heart the same, and if you can perform to a certain level in one area then you at least have the potential to do as well in others. That is why weak wizards and squibs cannot even grow magical plants properly, and why wizards who are masters in their chosen fields are almost always extremely gifted in other fields as well, and simply haven't specialized in them out of personal interest. Power is power and everyone recognizes this fact. If you think that anyone will hire a potion maker who can't perform a hover charm. But what can I do? Rigel interrupted loudly. She was standing now, glaring down at Snape and not caring that she was being rude or disrespectful. I've tried, I tell you, I've done those spells again and again and nothing happens. Rigel was shaking slightly, finally frustrated beyond her capacity to contain. All month her professors, her friends, and even her housemates had been pushing her, as if being told again and again that she was wrong or weak or stupid was going to help. I know I'm a failure as a wizard, she said quietly, her anger as unfamiliar to her as shouting was. But I can't just leave. My whole future is here at Hogwarts, and if you can't teach me just because of something that has nothing to do with potions, then all my hard work will have been wasted on nothing. And it will prove them right, she added silently. If I fail then it will prove everyone who thinks that half-bloods don't deserve to go to school here or can't keep up with real magic right. That was why she worked so hard to prove herself early on to Professor Snape and bent over backwards like a worm for Flint and pushed herself to her limits, hiding her injury and doing normal things with her friends so that no one would be suspicious of her or find a reason to kick her out. She had to stay at Hogwarts, for all the kids who didn't get the chance, who didn't have a pure-blooded cousin as kind and generous as Archie, who were scorned and practically exiled from their own country for something they could never change. And on top of standing up for everyone who couldn't take a stand themselves, she was taking all this crap for her dream, hers and Archie's. And she'd be damned if she let something as stupid as a piece of wood stand in her way. Rigel's temper flared once more, and she snatched her wand off the desk and whipped it down toward the row of glass jars sitting on a shelf beside the desk. The jars flew upwards like they'd been catapulted, crashing against the stone ceiling and shattering into a shower of glass and embalming fluid and dead, preserved icky bits. But Rigel was beyond caring. See, she cried, staring wildly into Snape's shocked face without really seeing it. See. I can do the spells. I can do them all. She slashed her wand in the pattern she'd slaved to memorize at the chair she'd been sitting in just minutes before, and the entire piece of furniture exploded into hundreds of needles, each transfigured from a tiny splinter of the original wood, which flooded the ground in a shiny puddle, sounding like rain hitting a metal roof, only the rain was the metal. She instinctively cast 2 simultaneous shield charms over Snape and herself to keep them from being embedded with flying needles, and by the time the dull haze of the shield charm flickered out she was left staring, exhausted and numb, at the utter wreck she'd made of Snape's office. Rigel would have sunk to the ground if there had been any spot of it that wasn't covered with needles or glass or animal parts, but as it was she merely swayed slightly, her sense catching up with her now that her emotions had been effectively drained off. She was almost too cowardly to look Snape in the face, almost. She raised her eyes in a kind of distant horror, physically steeling herself against his inevitable wrath. His office looked like an earthquake had passed through it at the same time as a museum of pointy objects, and the whole room smelled like preservation fluids. Well, Snape had found his tongue at last, it seemed, and Rigel prepared herself for a verbal lashing. I would ask to see the Lumos charm, but I've no desire to be blinded on top of nearly shredded. Rigel's brain didn't process the words at first, and then. Sir, she gaped, taking in his relaxed posture and half-lidded eyes. His face was blank, but his eyebrows were lifted sardonically, and there was something darkly amused about the way he held his mouth. I think it's safe to say that Ollivander was vastly mistaken in thinking that this wand was not just as destructive as the other ill-suited ones, he said calmly, taking his own wand out and methodically setting the room to rights. The needles and glass and ingredients were vanished, the fluids dried up, and a new chair conjured systematically. The only difference is that this wand was so well balanced that it took monumental effort of will to push the magic into manifesting though it. But, Rigel sat dazedly in the new chair, placing the ash wand carefully on the desk and rolling it out of her reach. She had shocked herself, yet again. Her magic, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor, in addition to being violent and sporadic. That little demonstration, while indicative of repressed emotion unbefitting a child of Salazar Slytherin, was nevertheless very informative, Snape said, rolling her wand very pointedly back toward her and speaking very slowly and clearly to make sure she understood him. I would guess that as a child your incidents of accidental magic were as rare as they were powerful, am I right, Mr. Black? Rigel shuddered. It was horrible. It only happened when I was so upset I couldn't stand the world anymore, and my magic would ravage the immediate vicinity. Luckily it never happened when anyone else was too close. It used to explode things, tear them, turn them inside out, and sometimes it just banished things completely, and we never found them again. Her face darkened considerably as she remembered. Such a thing had only happened 3 times in her youth, but each time was terrifying, and more disturbingly exhilarating. She learned never to get too upset by anything, never to get too excited or disappointed by things, in order to prevent her magic from stepping in and taking over. Mr. Black, are you afraid of magic? Snape asked, in what was for him a gentle tone. What? She blinked in surprise. No, of course not. How would I survive in a magical house or school if I was? Allow me to rephrase that, he said. Are you frightened by your own magic? Rigel opened her mouth to deny it, but paused, considering. Was Pansy right when she accused Rigel of not trying hard enough, of not really wanting the magic to work? You think I am unconsciously preventing myself from using magic? Rigel asked, the sinking feeling in her chest telling her she knew what his answer would be. It is one probable explanation, Snape said evenly, not a trace of pity or disgust in his tone, for which she was pathetically grateful. But then, wouldn't I have reason to be? She bit her lip. My magic seems to be unusually destructive. Not destructive, necessarily, her professor regarded her seriously, just improperly channeled. Magic is not inherently violent or mellow. It is we and our emotions that give it shape and force. So then I'm what's making it so dangerous, Rigel breathed. It's my fault, not the wand or the magic. There's something wrong with me. There is nothing wrong with you, the potion's master snapped, visibly reining himself in once more and continuing in a more neutral tone. It seems more likely that your first bout of accidental magic, which probably occurred when you were too young to recall, startled you in some way that made you reluctant to repeat the feat. You probably began unconsciously suppressing your strongest emotions in order to avoid catalyzing your magic, which then caused the magic to build up over time, until the next time you couldn't suppress an emotion, when it burst free all at once. Of course it took a negative shape. The emotions that are hardest to control are fear, anger, frustration, and the like. And so I became even more unnerved and suppressed more of my emotions and therefore more of my magic, until it became a cycle. Rigel's eyes widened with dismay. So all this time I've been trying to carefully control myself was actually making it worse. She let out a sharp breath and slumped in her chair dejectedly. What about my wand? You undoubtedly had such a strong control on your magic by the time you entered Ollivander's shop that it didn't call out to any of the wands there, which is how Ollivander usually knows which wands to try. I suppose he tried to guess blindly and make you try every wand there, but of course your magic was so pent up that unless the wand was perfect it reacted violently. He explained. The wand you ended up with was, I hesitate to say, probably the thickest and least conductive of the wands Ollivander had. It didn't cause anything to explode, but it prevented you from using magic even when you consciously tried to, unless the force of your will flooded the wand and overrode the buffers. Oh, Rigel said weakly. She tried to think. What did all this mean? She wasn't a squib, obviously, but would her magic be able to stabilize itself if she tried consciously using it more, or would she need some kind of therapy to overcome the unconscious reins she'd put on it? So, what now, sir, she asked, trying to collect her psyche into something resembling a rational young adult. Do I have to get a new wand? I suppose we'll have to see the headmaster. Rigel wondered why he looked so sour at that prospect. About obtaining a waiver for someone to come and collect you this Saturday, he said tightly. Couldn't you do it, sir? She blurted, new panic coursing through her at the thought of Sirius coming to get her, not Archie, from Hogwarts. I mean, not that I'm trying to take advantage of your kindness. She ignored the noise Snape made. But wouldn't it be better if someone from the school took me, so it doesn't look like I'm getting special treatment? You already understand the situation, she rushed on before he could answer, and it really wouldn't take that long since I've already tried most of the ones Mr. Ollivander has, and also, I don't think I'm ready to talk to my dad about this just yet. He might not understand it. She mentally congratulated herself for saying dad instead of parents and hoped her half-hopeful, half-shamefully forlorn expression was convincing. Snape was silent for a long, brooding minute, before he said, rather tiredly, I will speak to the headmaster about this, but either way you will be acquiring a new wand before you shame the House of Slytherin any further. Rigel smiled gratefully at her head of house. She rather thought he was only gruff and dismissive because he didn't know what else to be sometimes. Everything else can wait, he went on. It is late and this meeting has been more taxing than either of us likely anticipated. I will appraise your other professors with just enough information to keep them from failing you in the meantime. You may go now if there is nothing else. Rigel rose and was almost to the door before she cringed and turned back around to say, I'm sorry for making a mess of your office, Professor Snape, especially about the preserved ingredients. Were they valuable? I can pay. I do not require your filthy father's money, Snape was suddenly hissing, his face contorted into a spasm of loathing that froze her insides and stole her breath with its potency. For a moment neither of them moved, caught like statues and arrested in each other's gazes. Rigel didn't know what Snape could see in hers, confusion, perhaps, and a fair amount of startled fear, but in his she found hate, a hate so old that it had festered somehow, and she wondered how heavy a memory must be to sink emotion so deep, and how long a secret must be left in the dark to grow such fangs. Then he blinked, or she did, and the air was breathable again as some intangible darkness returned to the edges of the room, the edges of consciousness, where it belonged. Snape's entire frame shuddered slightly, and his eyes went as blank as a new blackboard once more. Forgive me, mister, he scowled fiercely at nothing, perhaps himself, forgive me. It's fine, Rigel said, her voice making up for his in-neutrality, it's been a trying evening for us both. I was only going to say, though, that I could pay you back with work if you wanted. You know, scrubbing cauldrons and the like, but that can wait as well. Good night, sir. Good evening. Friday morning found Rigel sitting calmly at the Slytherin table, enclosed on either side by her friends, and pretending that she wasn't avoiding looking at the staff table. Her friends didn't seem to notice her preoccupation, but knowing them they'd noticed and politely declined to comment on it, for which she was grateful. For some reason the hatred between her head of house and her father and uncles hadn't seemed real before. She had been aware of it, in snide comments James or Sirius would toss around when they noticed her reading one of Snape's articles, and in the way Remus carefully edited stories from their youth in deference to her respect for the potions master, but it had been nothing more than an abstract sort of obstacle to her. A barrier to be overcome like any other in her determination to be taught by the greatest, in her opinion, potions master alive. She hadn't thought of what that enmity meant for Professor Snape, who was faced with the child of his enemy and asked to shovel the foul mud of the past beneath a thin academic veneer every day, and for that she was ashamed. Who was she to think that almost 2 decades of grievance, and the kind of emotions that could fuel a fire for that many years, could be swept aside with the work of a few weeks? She would try harder, and be more patient, she promised herself. She wouldn't give up, but she wouldn't expect to be seen entirely in her own light for at least a couple years. She could live with that. As long as he was giving her instruction, no matter how bitterly, she could live with the specter of her uncle's adolescent memory hanging about. Her thoughts were interrupted when a speckled eagle owl swooped down and dropped a letter in front of her before sailing off once more, not even stopping to nip at some bacon. The letter was only saved from being dunked in her oatmeal by Draco's quick seeker's hands. "Thanks," she said, taking the letting carefully from Draco and checking the envelope. It was definitely for her, but aside from the words Rigel Black on the front, the envelope was completely nondescript. She tucked it slowly into her robe pocket, glad for once that her injury meant she only had to keep her one visible hand from shaking. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but if it was from Archie, an eagle owl meant an emergency letter that couldn't be read in front of others, so in case he'd used a handwriting charm for some reason, Rigel didn't dare open it with so many curious eyes around. Her fellow Slytherins might not come out and ask her about it, but her every reaction could be noted and weighed if she wasn't careful. Maybe she was being paranoid, and certainly she'd been accused of being overly cautious in the past, though Archie's exact words had involved a stick wedged in an undesirable place, but she'd rather be safe than thrown into prison for blood impersonation. She didn't get a chance to read the letter until halfway through herbology, when Draco and Pansy, and everyone else, were distracted by 2 of the venomous tentacular plants trying to strangle one another. It took Professor Sprout 10 minutes to calm the plants down, but Rigel didn't need even a fraction of the time to read the strange letter. It was more of a note, really. "Mr. Black. Be at Greenhouse 4 by sundown, or everyone will know your secret. Come alone." That was it. Rigel crumpled the parchment into her good fist and stuffed it into her pockets before anyone noticed, but the words played themselves over in her mind throughout the rest of the lesson, and even not mischievously brushing some dirt off of Draco's forehead, while really streaking the dirt onto it, could not lighten her mood for long. The message was vague enough that she almost had to go. She wasn't stupid, she knew that it might be an elaborate trap, a bluff to get her on her own, and the person who wrote it might not have any secrets she'd care about being exposed, but if they did, well, a bluff always worked if the one it was aimed at had too much to lose to call it. The only thing to decide was how to slip away. In the end, she reverted to the timeless maneuver often favored by toddlers when faced with a pile of vegetables. She faked a stomachache. She didn't fake it well, of course, and so her friends naturally assumed an underlying cause. "Is this about whatever Professor Snape called you in for last night?" Draco asked. "You can talk to us, you know," Pansy said. Rigel insisted, in a rather unconvincing way, that it wasn't about that, and told them she was going to see the nurse and perhaps lie down for a while. They were appropriately unconvinced and thereby entrenched even deeper in the idea that her reticence was just about her meeting with Snape the night before, and so neither of her friends looked for a more hidden motive. They agreed to go to dinner without her, but she had been careful to leave them suspicious enough that if Rigel wasn't back by curfew someone would come looking for her. While everyone else was at dinner that evening, Rigel was slipping past the cheery warmth of the great hall and out into the fading light of the setting sun. By the time she got to the greenhouses it was nearly twilight, and she waited with iron patience for the letter writer to appear. She had the strange feeling that she was being observed, which was validated when 2 figures appeared suddenly in the dim light, melting out of the shadows as if they'd thrown off invisibility charms after checking that she had, indeed, come alone. Well, what have we here? He really came. Looks like you were right, he did have something to hide. Rigel set her teeth. She'd been prepared for a trap, but she hadn't thought showing up was the trap, and that by doing so she'd give away the very existence of her secrets. She'd have to re-evaluate the estimation of her own intelligence. The figures emerged from the shadow of Greenhouse 4 and she recognized them with little real surprise. Their voices alone were quite distinctive. "Welcome, little secret keeper." Olden Rosier smiled like a saber-toothed tiger and his honey-colored eyes glowed eerily in the light of the fading sun. "It seems I had reason to suspect you after all. Come, won't you tell us what secrets you hold so dear that you willingly endanger yourself for them?" Rigel backed away slightly, but too late she realized that Rookwood had come up on her other side and boxed her in against the greenhouse. She stopped backing away and lifted her chin with the kind of stubborn pride Draco would have shown in this situation, and Rosier's darkly whimsical laughter twisted the air before her face as he leaned closer to inspect her expression. Perhaps even more unnerving than Rosier was Rookwood's silent, watchful presence to her right. No. A shame. Rosier leaned back again on a sigh, but, ultimately we did not come here to learn your secrets, petty though they undoubtedly are. What is it you want, then? Rigel asked, barely able to keep her voice above a hoarse whisper. We don't trust you. Rookwood spoke suddenly, his ocean-deep voice pulsing through the shadows. That's right. Rosier smiled sadly, almost apologetically. Pansy vouches for you, but as much as we adore that girl, she is young, and innocent enough to be easily misled. By coming here you have shown us that you keep secrets, even from Pansy and Malfoy, or they would be here with you, and for that you can't be trusted. Rigel's face was blank but her mind was incredulous. She couldn't be trusted. Who's the one sending cryptic, threatening notes to 11-year-olds? And those who cannot be trusted, Rookwood said ominously, must be tested. Tested, she repeated blankly. Yes, tested. Rosier looked gleeful, now, like a child on his birthday, or like a crazy person with a bouquet of dead mice. If we're to approve your friendship with Pansy, you must be worthy in some way, and since it is obvious you aren't trustworthy, we'll just have to see if you're another kind of worthy. Rigel didn't like where this was going. It was very brave of you to come out here alone to face an unknown enemy, Rookwood said. Either that, or very cowardly. Were you terribly afraid we'd spill you precious secrets? Rosier asked tauntingly, shall we find out which it is? Rigel's face must have given something away, for he said, oh, don't look so scared, little snake. We just want to see if you're worthy of your house, that's all. Just run a little errand for us, and you'll be on your way. What kind of an errand? Rigel asked, partly relieved that they were finally getting to the point of all this. The kind that tests your resourcefulness, of course, Rosier said, still smiling that winning smile of his. You really can't be a Slytherin without Slytherin's qualities. Of course, if you don't want to do it, all you have to do is agree to break off your friendship with Pansy. If you won't be around her, we don't care how unworthy you are. No, Rigel said, louder than she'd intended. She glared at the two upperclassmen. Pansy's my friend, and if you know her half as well as you think you'd know that Pansy doesn't let anyone decide her life for her, and she definitely won't appreciate this kind of maneuvering behind her back. Yes, that's true, Rookwood said, but what Pansy doesn't know won't get us into trouble with her. You won't be telling her. It wasn't a question. Well, if you're sure Pansy's worth all this trouble. Rosier trailed off airily. She is. Rigel scowled. Pansy wouldn't be happy with her if the blonde girl ever found out about this, but Rigel wouldn't trade her friendship for anything, now that she had it. And if she had to do something to earn it in Rosier and Rookwood's eyes, so be it. The two older Slytherins smiled at one another, and Rigel wondered if refusing to renounce Pansy wasn't part of the challenge in itself. Wonderful. Rosier pressed his hands together delightedly. Then here is your task. Rookwood spoke then, slowly and clearly, though not exactly reassuringly. You will acquire 2 sprigs of fresh Canterbury and bring it back here. You have 2 hours. She stood gaping at them. Canterburies grew in trees. In trees that would probably be found quite a ways into the Forbidden Forest, considering how little sunlight the plant required. Go, Rosier said, and laughed again at the disbelieving stare the young first year was leveling at him. Be glad it's not a full moon tonight. Rigel rolled her eyes disgustedly, but she had already agreed to do their ridiculous task, and the sooner she figured out how to get it done, the better. She took off at a jog toward the edge of the Forbidden Forest, careful to give Hagrid's cabin a wide berth, in case his dog had sensitive ears. The only thing worse than traipsing through the Forbidden Forest at night would have to be being caught traipsing through the Forbidden Forest at night. The forest, which seemed so hauntingly silent during the day, teemed with life and sound once the sun had set. The tiniest breeze set the leaves to whistling, and every twig snapping beneath her feet sounded like a gunshot going off in the middle of a concerto for strings, not eerily loud compared to the sounds around it, but awkwardly out of place. Rigel carefully studied the trees that she passed. Canterburies grew in bunches on vines, much like common grapes, and the vines liked to wrap themselves around the widest trees they could find. The trees on the edge of the forest weren't nearly wide enough, so she'd have to keep going. She knew that trees got bigger as they got older or as they got closer to water. The older trees would be in the very center of the forest, where it had first begun, but that was also the most dangerous section of the forest. Since the trees seemed to be growing bigger in two different directions, she assumed that there was a water source nearby and followed the trees that grew larger parallel to the edge of the forest to be safe. About 15 minutes of walking later, she came upon a good-sized stream, which judging by the current probably ran into the Black Lake eventually. At the edges of the stream, the trees were wide and stately, and sure enough the distinctive twisting vines of the Canterbury plant trailed conspicuously from the sturdy branches to skim the surface of the water. Rigel gazed up at the bunches of berries, hanging tauntingly out of her reach, even if she jumped. She might have had time to run and grab a broom from the Quidditch sheds, but they were locked after sundown and her useless wand would probably freak out again if she tried an Alohomora with it. Instead she grimly surveyed her surroundings for something that would help her climb a tree one-handed. She thought she could manage getting the sprigs once she was up there, but reaching the lowest branches with one good arm was going to be a pain. Rigel first pulled a few of the looser vines from a nearby tree and began braiding them together, using her teeth when necessary to get a good, tight braid. Next she shucked out of her robes, glad the slacks and shirt she had on underneath were fitted enough that they wouldn't catch on anything. She hefted her new rope braid and after a few tries managed to loop it over the lowest branch, which was still a good 8 feet above her head, of one of the trees. She tied one end in a slip knot and tightened it until she had one long strand of rope fastened securely to the branch above her. Now came the annoying part. Her robes were wrapped quickly around her right arm from palm to elbow, and she looped all the excess rope around her forearm, outside of the robes. It cut off circulation slightly when she put her full weight on it, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been without the padding. Gripping the makeshift rope tightly in her right hand, she cradled her left wrist protectively against her chest and made a running jump toward the tree, pushing off against the trunk with her feet as hard as she could and wrapping the slack around her good arm furiously while in midair. She sagged with a grunt against the rope, but she was now about 3 feet off of the ground. Rigel swayed back and forth on the rope until she could touch the bark with her feet. She dug in with her shoes and propelled herself upwards as hard as she could again, gaining another loop of slack around her wrist before gravity took over once more. She did this several more times, gasping and swearing each time her body weight pulled the rope taut across her arm, but soon she was high enough that one last push against the trunk gave her the leverage to twist and swing one leg over the top of the branch she was tied to, and she lay, panting but victorious, across the thick branch as she slowly unwound the rope from her groaning arm. Her left wrist was only a bit jostled from swinging up onto the branch, and by the time she got her balance and sat up straight on the sturdy limb she was feeling pretty pleased with herself. The Canterburies were growing on vines just a few feet higher up, and she easily broke off a few springs by standing and leaning on the trunk for balance. Getting down was much faster. She wrapped her right hand in her robes again and used the rope to slide down as slowly as she could manage, thankful that years of playing beater and weeks of relying solely on her right arm meant she had good strength and grip in that hand. Though it was more freefall than rappelling, she managed to get to the forest floor without spraining anything. Rigel was disheveled, her white shirt covered with leaves and dirt and her robes torn through in places the rope had rubbed too hard, but she was flushed and smiling cheerfully as she wrapped the sprigs of Canterburies in her ruined robes like a makeshift sack. Her smug mood evaporated when an amused voice broke into the clearing from behind her. "Quite pleased with himself, isn't he? Little Popinjay." She whirled, keeping a tight grip on the sack of berries, and nearly groaned aloud when Rosier and Rookwood dropped disillusionment charms simultaneously. "I'd say he's earned a bit of self-satisfaction," Rookwood shrugged. "He certainly made quick work of our task." Yes, Rosier looked a bit disappointed. "It seems our 2-hour time limit didn't give Mr. Black enough credit. And he even retrieved them manually right off. I was so looking forward to seeing him try to sever a branch or summon one of them with those magic-resistant spells I cast on most of the trees in place." "You've been watching this whole time." Rigel frowned at herself for not noticing she was being followed. As if he'd read her thoughts, Rookwood said, "Don't beat yourself up over it. We used muffling spells and were always out of your line of vision, so even if we hadn't been invisible I doubt you'd have spotted us." Rigel sighed. "Well, I got these ridiculous berries. I doubt either of you really want to make Punion cream, which is about all these are good for, So do I really have to haul them all the way back to the greenhouses? No, no, Rosia waved a hand dismissively, the berries don't matter. What's important is that you completed your mission and showed resourcefulness. You pass, feel free to befriend Pansy, etc. Now what I really want to know. The slim young man walked toward Rigel until he was right in her face, which he seemed to think the appropriate distance for examining someone closely, is why you tried to climb that tree one-handed. Rigel inwardly groaned. Of course they had seen that if they'd watched the entire thing. It figures that she would come out here for the exact purpose of keeping her secrets, only to reveal one, albeit a minor one that several people already knew, in the process. His left hand is injured, Rookwood commented, likely broken. Rigel made an ungrateful face at the stoic upperclassman for pointing that out, but snapped her head back with a yelp when Rosia took it upon himself to prod the wrapped area firmly with the tip of his finger. The wrist does appear to be fractured. At least Rosia smiled like he'd found a new game to play. Why on earth are you walking around with an injured wrist in a school with a certified mediwitch on staff? My reasons are my own, Rigel said shortly, moving her injured arm behind her back and stepping out of Rosia's reach. It looks like we found a secret after all, Edmund. Rosia smiled conspiratorially at Rookwood, who raised an eyebrow in return. I guess making him complete the task was unnecessary, then the taller boy said unconcernedly. Indeed, he has turned out to be trustworthy after all. Rosia laughed at Rigel's flummoxed expression. Now having secrets makes me trustworthy. Mr. Black, try to think like a Slytherin once in a while, won't you? The golden-eyed boy tutted admonishingly. Us knowing one of your secrets makes you trustworthy, because a person can always be trusted to protect their secrets. Everyone has secrets, Rigel, and a person we know has secrets is always less dangerous than a person who appears to have none. If you say so, Rosia. Rigel shook the berries out of her robes and bundled them under her arm. If our business is concluded, I would like to get back before my friends miss me. Oh, our business is far from completed. Rosia's smile was a dangerous blade, but we'll be happy to walk you back to the castle now. Wouldn't do to let Pansy's new friend get lost in the woods. But first, Edmund, would you mind? Rookwood stepped forward and drew his wand with a practiced grace. Rigel stumbled backwards, but the quiet Slytherin grabbed her shoulder before she could retreat any further. Rookwood slid a broad hand down her biceps to bring her left arm back in front of her carefully. She flinched when he reached for her wrist, but it was only to peel the sleeve of her once white shirt out of the way. Rosia came over to help with unwrapping her bandages, bringing his left hand to seize her right wrist firmly when she tried to bring up a hand to stop them. Once the wrist was uncovered, they both bent their heads to study it critically. I'd actually expected worse, Rosia said thoughtfully. The bone has already been set, Rookwood said, it just wasn't healed. The stoic boy's fingers were gentle as he probed the area around the break. How long ago was this broken? Rigel glanced between them confusedly. Rosia's magnanimous smile did not reassure her, but Rookwood's unflappable calm did, so she said, I broke it the first Saturday of the term. How? Rosia asked curiously. Fell down some stairs, she shrugged. Rookwood's mouth turned down in a puzzled frown, obviously comparing the pattern of the break to her story, so she elaborated. The strap of my bag twisted around my wrist and probably caught against something when I fell, so it was pulled taut until it snapped. Rookwood nodded easily, but Rosia winced sympathetically. That must have hurt. I supposed you passed out. Rigel grimaced, but nodded. Thought so, Rosia said. If you were awake when it happened, the scream would have brought someone running, and you'd have been shipped off to the hospital wing. Still don't see why you didn't go there anyway, but I'm sure I'll figure it out eventually. Rigel was distracted from Rosia's chatter by Rookwood pointing his wand at her broken wrist with a look of fierce concentration on his face that foretold a complicated spell of some kind. Don't worry, Rosia said cheerfully. Edmund's uncle, the one who doesn't work on the creature reserve, is a resident at St. Mungo's. If he accidentally, vanishes all your bone or something, his uncle will probably fix you up for free. Don't listen to Olden's nonsense, Black Rookwood said. His voice was rough but soothing, like sand being swept across a Zen garden. I mend animals at the shelter my family runs all the time. Take a deep breath and hold still. Rigel found herself automatically listening to the upperclassman's soothing voice. She could see how he'd make a good handler for temperamental magical creatures with his calmly capable demeanor. Rookwood cast a numbing spell that made her ears roar strangely for a moment. She missed the incantation he spoke next, but a hot then cold sensation rushed up her elbow from the break, and the next moment she was staring in awe at her perfectly mended wrist. "You'll have to be careful to build up the strength in it again, but the muscle won't have atrophied much," Rookwood said. "I wouldn't recommend climbing any trees for a few days." Rigel was completely confused, but also extremely relieved. She wouldn't have to do everything one-handed anymore, which meant she could stop failing flying class, and she had one less thing to lie to her friends about now. "Thank you very much." "It was no trouble," Rookwood assured her. "Secrets aren't that interesting once you know about them anyway." Rosia yawned. "Now that this one is gone, I'll just have to find out another of your secrets before I can trust you." He winked playfully at her, but Rigel was too grateful to roll her eyes, and as they made the long trek back up to the castle, she thought maybe Rosia didn't really mean anything by it. Even though they dragged her out to the forbidden forest and made her climb a tree for a bunch of useless berries, they hadn't really hurt her. They couldn't have known in setting the task that she had an injury, and they hadn't let her really wander through the forest by herself, though she hadn't known that at the time. Rosia had even had Rookwood fix her wrist, saving her another month of trouble in the process. Maybe she was being too forgiving, but Rigel was a big proponent of turn the other cheek and let bygones be bygones, except perhaps in the most extreme of cases. It just wasn't in her to hold on to her annoyance in a grudge or vendetta. That was probably why she had a hard time understanding the level of hostility that lent itself to the 20 years of enmity that Snape and the Marauders had held on to. Seeing the way Pansy's face lit up happily when Rigel entered the common room flanked by Rosia and Rookwood kind of made the whole thing worth it, too. She was clearly ecstatic to see that her oldest friends approved of Rigel, and Rigel didn't think the other girl even noticed that all three of them, though mostly Rigel, were strewn with leaves and twigs and smelled like moss. Later, as she tried to fall asleep, after tossing and turning just because with her wrist no longer broken she could, Rigel thought that perhaps an easy, settled life was overrated, anyway. End of chapter 13.